Yeah? Good evening, good afternoon, welcome everyone. Is it okay? Can you hear me? Yes. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to see all of you here in one room. Thank you for accepting the invitation to come to Berlin at this difficult hour of a European Championship of Soccer. But you all made it, so that's already something nice. Between State and Exile, Rethinking Jewish Politics, that's what we're here to talk about for the next 3 days. And it is, I think, meaningful, even to some extent historical, having in one room, the same room, so many people, intellectuals worldwide that have been working for so many years on the questions that this conference would like to deal with. Questions of politics, question of Jewish politics, and it is especially meaningful to have this meeting right now in these catastrophic times, catastrophic on many levels. Gilad here will shortly say more about the contents and the ideas that we asked the group of organizers hoped that this meeting will deal with. I will now just say some words of introduction concerning the material, institutional conditions. So the place where you are all now, some of you already know it, some of you are here for the first time, is called, as you already figured it out, the Catholic Academy, Berlin. The Catholic Academy is, there are Catholic academies in different places in Germany, and there are also evangelical academies, and their role is to offer a stage, a place, a forum for public discussions, very centrally connected to issues of religion, politics, culture. And this event is organized within a specific program of the Catholic Academy of Berlin, which is called the Berlin Center for Intellectual Diaspora, which is a program that I have co-founded and have been co-directing together with two colleagues, Stefan Steiner and Gesine Palmer, who are not now with us. They'll probably join us tomorrow. And the idea of this program is to, again, offer a space, a forum to debate, to deal with questions of timely, kind of contemporary concern in the meeting place between religion, politics, and culture. And the idea is to bring people who are academics, intellectual, have been working on different traditions, bringing them together to deal with questions that are not only academic, that have some kind of a public interest, and therefore most of the events usually have at least one part that is public, and also our event has parts that are more, let's say, intimate, closed parts, and parts that open up to larger public, the evening lectures, for example. And it is in this framework that we also organize our conference now today. I would like to use this introduction to pronounce my acknowledgement and thanks to the staff of the Academy who organized all the different details that make up a conference. Ines Alberg, Ludger Montag, Amir Decolonizing, who is here with us now, Rebecca Welling, which is also here and will assist us during the conference, as well also Pierre Pazler, who is sitting here and is responsible on the cameras and the recordings and the live streaming. So again, thank you all. A word about our conference. The conference is a cooperation between the Berlin Center for Intellectual Diaspora, the University of Lille, my own university, the Berman Center at Lehigh University, the University of Södertörn in Stockholm, the Humboldt University, and it received the generous support by the Thyssen Foundation and the Foundation for Baltic and East European Studies. And I am very, very grateful also to my co-conveners, Gilad Sharvit, who is sitting next to me, Agata-Bielik Robson, Shaul Magid, Nitzan Lebovic, and Amir Engel. Thank you for this very pleasant cooperation. I want to look with you for a second on the program. You all got the programs. I just want to go quickly over the program and just give you some practical notes. So the program is this document. You can also find it online on the, I hope you all received the links with the program. So we are starting this afternoon with the first panel. After this, we'll have the first public lecture. After the public lecture, we'll have dinner together in a kind of buffet style where both speakers and guests will be invited. It will take place downstairs, not in this court, but the one that is one court over there to the left. You will follow me, I will show you. It's not far away, it's easy to find. The Supreme Court, yes, the second Supreme Court. So tomorrow we'll start at 10 o'clock. Before that, you can find here coffee and some pastries. We'll have lunch here downstairs in the building, in the Katholische Academy. All the meals will take place around the building. And in the afternoon, after the different panels, Yael Attia, that I don't see here now, will offer to all those who wish a short round tour in here around the neighborhood, not far away from the Catholic Academy. So those who don't know yet Berlin and this area are very, very welcome to join her. We'll have, at the end of the day, another public lecture, after which we'll all have dinner at another little space here in the Catholic Academy. I will show it to you. The next day, again, more or less the same thing. The only difference is that before the public lecture in the evening, we'll have an artist talk. I think tomorrow, Benjamin Reich, the photographer, will bring here some of his posters, and we'll have a little exhibition. And then there will be an artist talk with him, with the writer Deborah Feldman, with a little music performance by Eva Glasmacher. And we'll finish again the day with a public lecture. And the last part of the conference will take place on Wednesday morning. We'll have 2 sessions before lunch, and then we'll end, after lunch, we'll end with the final discussion. And I want to finish by reminding you that at the end of this conference will not be the end of the events this week. There is, right after this conference, another shorter conference dedicated to Jacob Israel Dahan, 100 years to his assassination. And the inaugural opening event of this conference will be, will start with a screening of a new documentary by Tzvi Lanzmann on the life and assassination of Dahan. And the film will be screened at a cinema not very far from him, around 15 minutes walk away from here, or 20 minutes walk. At the Rosa Luxemburg Platz. The cinema is called Cinema Babylon Mitte. And you're all invited to join. After the film, we'll have a panel discussion on Dahan's literature. And the next day, we are now already Thursday morning, we'll have 2 more panels on Dahan, on his politics and question of sexuality. So that's the week that is now ahead of us. And with this, I think I said all I had to tell you for the moment, institutionally and materially, and I will now give the stage to Gilad to talk about the content. Please, Gilad.
Yeah, we should always start with the food. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Gilad Sharvit, and I'm really happy, and I would like to echo Elad and thank you all for coming. I would also deeply thank my partners in organizing this event, Shaul and Agata, Nitzan, and Amir, and special thanks to Elad for all your efforts in making this wonderful event a reality. This is really your achievement, and I really thank you for that. This conference began with a frustration, at least for me. It was a year ago, during the peak of the judicial revolution by the still current Netanyahu government, amidst an ongoing wave of demonstrations, panels, conferences, podcasts, and op-eds about the future of democracy in Israel. I kept asking myself if this is unavoidable, even inevitable. If this upheaval in Israel's political system and the autocratic sentiments of growing parts of the Israel society are preordained. Should we explain this challenge to democracy in structural terms, as many do when considering the political reality in parts of Europe, United States, and South America? Or is there something uniquely Jewish about all this? That is, does the Jewish nature of the state, defined very broadly, contribute to this autocratic term? In some way, this returns to the still unanswered question that concerned early architects of the state. What does the adjective Jewish actually describe? Is Judaism a closed system of thought of and for a privileged few, disregarding the world outside and also those inside the state of Israel? Is Judaism an ancient religion that pronounces, procures, or at the very least tolerates exclusivity and Jewish supremacy? In political terms, must Judaism end in a theocracy, a political system based on the laws of the halacha, as some members of the current government believe? Or as the liberal Jewish community has insisted for the last 250 years, is Judaism a religion deeply invested in social justice, concerned for the foreigner and the poor, and well aligned with progressive ideals of democracy and equality? The Zionist project and the establishment of the State of Israel did not put an end to this conversation, but rather magnified the stakes of the different perspectives. Specifically, many feared and still fear that a Jewish sovereign state heralds or would herald the decline of Judaism, as Israel signals a departure from the historical condition of statelessness, which has been a defining characteristic of Jewish existence. Throughout centuries of exile, Jews developed a unique identity intimately linked to their position as a dispersed minority. This condition of exile fostered a particular set of values, practices, and even sentiments, emphasizing moral and ethical principles, intellectual engagement, and an enduring commitment to social justice. It was a condition that positioned Judaism as a site of resistance to state violence, oppression, and tyranny. Recent scholarship has reworked this conceptual challenge by way of an increasing interest in the question of Jewish exile, galut, not as a negative category to be overcome, but as an existential posture perhaps to be embraced. We have among us today some of the major contributors to this conversation about the different meanings of statelessness and of exile as a political term. This conversation, however, is not abstract or theoretical, and it is not a conversation solely of and within the Jewish world, as the last horrible months sadly illustrated all too well. And I do want to acknowledge at this moment the emails and the support that we got from some of you encouraging us to continue with the plan of the conference. At least speaking for myself, there was a moment in the very beginning of everything that I thought this is actually doesn't make any sense. And I do acknowledge and I appreciate all your emails about that. So these recent months have demonstrated something that too many in Israel attempt to forget, the very thing that early Zionism attempted to disregard, that any conversation about Jewish politics is and must be a dialogue between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. What the next few days will evidently show is that the question of Jewish politics, such as whether Judaism aligns with progressive values, is not a question that was only asked at the end of the 19th century Europe, but a question that must be asked again and again. It must be asked today in the context of this present state of crisis, and it must be asked not as an inner Jewish question, but one that takes the Palestinian perspective seriously. The topic of exile and sovereignty is at the core of this dilemma. And here, I hope you allow me to be heretic for a moment. I don't think that we are faced with two distinct and exclusive alternatives: statelessness and disempowerment, or statehood and power. Some indeed think about Jewish politics that way: Israel or exile, sovereignty or statelessness. However, I would like to suggest that we are talking about a continuum, or better, a spectrum of political and theoretical worldviews about Jewish politics in general and about Israel-Palestine in particular. What I think is fascinating is that the serious consideration of the ideas of exile is not a blasphemous act of anti-Zionism, or not only that, but rather an honest and constructive attempt to think of new formulation of the political system in the realm of sovereignty. Revisiting Jewish politics is not a conference on Middle East policy, although this theme will surely be brought up. Nor is it a conference on Jewish politics in the Middle Ages, although insights from that period would be beneficial. What we're trying to do here is to tackle an urgent question about the nature of Jewish politics that is on everyone's mind today, and rightly so. Some of us will address this question directly, engaging with the dire situation in Israel-Palestine, thinking about it through the lens of post-colonial studies or political theology, and some by way of engagement with theory or history. We will hear about figures such as Derrida, Levinas, and Rav Kook, American and German Jewish thinker, and ideas drawn from post-World War II philosophy and other. However, in the last few years, and especially in the last few months, discussion about Jewish politics have become increasingly polemical. I'm not talking about dialogue between left and right, which is important on its own, but dialogues between different voices and shades within the left. Let's call them liberal and progressive, left Zionism and anti or non-Zionist. The aim of this conference is to reframe this conversation and to provide a space for hard and maybe even difficult conversations about Jewish politics today. We don't have the luxury of maintaining a scholarly distance from the content matter of the next few days. And while I am convinced that we will all hear ideas and political models that we wholeheartedly disagree with, I still wish us a fruitful conversation, one that Jewish politics urgently needs right now, and the immediate violence in Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and the region. Thank you.
So we invite now the first panel of the conference.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all. My name is Amir Engel. I teach at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and currently a visiting professor here at the Humboldt University. I'm honored to present our first panel of this conference. I have to say that I've been involved in the organization of this conference, and it's amazing to see you in person after this project has been going on in discussion for so long. To see you all here is wonderful. I welcome you to Berlin. I prepared very short presentations. I'm going to introduce Agata first and then Nitzan, and because I assume we all know each other more or less, so just formally, and then we'll hear both talks and we'll have some time for discussion. Okay? So Agata-Bielik Robson is our first speaker. She's professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Nottingham and also professor of philosophy at the Polish Academy of Science. Her research focuses on philosophical aspects of psychoanalysis, romantic subjectivity, and Jewish philosophical theology. Among her many publications, I want to mention her two most recent books. Another, Finitude, Messianic Vitalism and Philosophy, came out in 2019, and quite recently, her book, Derrida's Marano Passover, Exile, Survival, Betrayal, and the Metaphysics of Non-Identity from last year. The title of our talk today is On Advantages and Disadvantages of Diaspora for Jewish Life. I'm going to introduce Nitzan very quickly, and then I'll give you the stage. Nitzan Lebovic is Professor of History and the Apter Chair of Holocaust Studies and Ethical Values at Lehigh University. His research focuses on German and German-Jewish intellectual history and the history of the Holocaust, history of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. He's the author of The Philosophy of Life and Death, Ludwig Klages and the Rise of Nazi Biopolitics, and very soon his next book is coming out in a few months with Cornell, titled Zionism and Melancholy, The Short Life of Israel, Zachi. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it. Okay, completely missed it. Okay. Homo Temporalis, Martin Buber, Walter Benjamin, and Hannah Arendt. Again, his book coming out, forthcoming 2025, is Homo Temporalis, Martin Buber, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, and Paul Celan, About Time. All right, Agata, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. So, how does it function? Just I press this. Yeah.
Coming down.
I should give you. Press this. Okay. Thank you. Right. I'm going to be a little bit nasty to Levinas. It's a kind of a warning before I begin to speak. According to the widespread Christian belief, exile is a punishment which God ordered against his once favorite people for the fact that they had failed to recognize the true Messiah. Scattered all over the world, deprived of the land and political sovereignty, the Jews were supposed to suffer from the precarious dependence on the whims of the more powerful hosts. This negative view of the diasporic life as divine punishment was also popular among the Jews, although for different reasons. The dispersion was meant as the penance for Israel's disobedience to God's decrees. Yet this negative view was not necessarily prevalent. The alternative to punishment was the idea of exile as a messianic mission and Jews as the missionaries of the law of Zion. The classical locus of the affirmation of diaspora from the moral point of view is Isaiah 2:3, which justifies scattering as the necessary stage of spreading the Jewish model of social justice and making the law of Zion universally known to all nations until they adopt it as their own. For out of Zion shall the law be proclaimed, from Jerusalem the word of the Lord. He shall judge between the nations, administer justice among all peoples. They will forge their swords into plowshares and their spears into vineyard knives. Nation shall not live upsword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Even if later on the rabbinic Judaism would give up on Judaism as a proselytic religion, Isaiah's messianic vision of the diaspora as the righteous scattered among all peoples never lost its appeal. Isaiah's ethical justification of the scattering became particularly relevant after the failed anti-Rome uprising and the destruction of the Second Temple. A new genre of the so-called Jewish apocalypse emerged, in which the fall of the temple and the beginning of the exile became a subject of intense prophetic visions, concerned about the future role of the Jews in dispersion. One of them, yes, of course. One of them, the Apocalypse of Baruch, written towards the end of the first century, stipulates this role in the Isaiah manner by making God announce, I will scatter this people among the Gentiles, that they may do good to the Gentiles. The Jewish righteous, therefore, must become suffering servants and experience the hardships of exile, but this is what God calls his myth of time. The Apocalypse of Baruch is the first instance of the historiosophical mode of thinking, which methodically reveals the laws of history, where the ethical influence of the exiled Jews on the Gentiles is defined as the major formative activity of hastening the times and preparing the advent of the universal Messiah. A similar attitude towards the scattering appears in Baruch's senior contemporary, Philo of Alexandria. He too utters the praise of diaspora as an agent of the moral progress of mankind, yet in a different idiom than the former's apocalyptic messianic historiosophy. According to Philo Judaeus, the Jews do not have to suffer catastrophic losses in order to choose living in diaspora. They do not need to be expelled from the land and temple because scattering is their natural ethical vocation. Those who left the land of Israel should thus always remember it as the place of their encounter with God, but the fact that they live in the diaspora is also positive, for they can now tell about this encounter and its result in the form of the Mosaic laws to other nations. Since those laws, says Philo, are as universal as the laws of nature, they should not be bound to the particular place of their origin. Neither Baruch nor Philo recommend religious conversion of the Gentiles to Judaism. Technically, it did not yet exist, but not conversion to the religious form of Judaism, but they nonetheless advocate for an ethical conversion, an adoption of the universal law of Zion, which for them marks a visible moral progress of the whole mankind. In the 20th century, already marked by the emergence of Zionism, the pro-diasporic argument becomes more polemical. Challenged by the Zionist call to end the pathology of exile, it begins to accentuate stronger universalist stakes by distancing itself from the particularist vision of Judaism and Jewishness. In the late modern Jewish thinkers, from the Frankfurt School to Levinas and Derrida, the Judaic theologumena serve as the vehicles of universal communication in creating ethico-political models of thought strongly critical of the sovereign power of nation-states and offering a moral teaching of the so-called counter-sovereignty. In most cases, however, they do not reject the main point of the Zionist agenda, which was the creation of the State of Israel. They rather expect of the newly emerging Jewish state not to be like all other nation-states, based on the Schmittian model of militant sovereignty, and in that manner once again be capable of setting a moral example to follow. Such view, combining both sensibilities, diasporic and Zionist, was espoused by young Gershom Scholem, the proponent of Messianic Zionism, which insisted on the ethical difference of the Jewish state formation. Although he soon became disillusioned with the Zionist politics, which, as he bitterly announced in the 1931 letter to Walter Benjamin, put itself on the world market and, I quote, degenerated into a prostitution of the last remnants of our youth, his early project still remains valid. By staging a dialogic platform between the Zionist desire to create Jewish state as the safe haven for the Jews returning from the endangered exile, on the one hand, and the diasporic ethical vigilance against the abuses of power inscribed into the modern construct of nation-states on the other, Scholem project of Messianic Zionism addresses a vital need, which also motivates our conference, a need for rethinking and rekindling the dialogue between Zionism and the so-called diasporic consciousness. It is indeed a high time to break the impasse in which the diasporic thinkers criticize the realpolitik of Israel from the moral high ground, while the Zionists accuse them of taking an easy position of beautiful souls, who avoid any real action in order to remain ethically pure. A more constructive dialogue is possible, and this is what my presentation wishes to address. I would like to endorse the main tenets of the diasporic messianism understood as an ethical mission among the nations, but also offer a critique of a certain version of it, especially in reference to Levinas' anti-Hegelian apology of the beautiful soul as the pure ethical outsider. I will enter into polemic with Levinas and, with the little help of Derrida, argue that we need a more dialectical ethical position which will be able to mediate between the brutality of active realpolitik and the pure morals of the judgmental, beautiful soul. This is not to say, however, that Levinas and Derrida are strictly opposed to one another. In fact, they both espouse the Sholemian hopes in the emergence of the State of Israel as another sovereignty. But they differ in understanding the exilic ethics, that is, the way in which exile shapes the fundamental perception of the moral values in confrontation with the imperfect reality of the world. While Levinas has a dangerous tendency to slip into the position of a purely judgmental, beautiful soul, Derrida, in his polemical deconstruction of Levinas' ethics, counteracts this tendency by rendering it simply practical, and thus fulfilling the condition which Levinas formulates as necessary and yet simultaneously impeaches as impossible. I don't know if you can see anything on the screen, but obviously Levinas says the political world must remain related to the ideal world. So the question which Levinas himself poses, is there no alternative between having recourse to those unscrupulous methods typified by realpolitik and the irritating rhetoric of an incautious idealism that is lost in utopian dreams but turns to dust on contact with reality? This question must thus also be asked of his own ethics. Now, as so many other terms and motifs, Hegel takes the concept of the beautiful soul, die schöne Seele, from Goethe. This time from his saga on Wilhelm Meister, where one of the female protagonists, a member of a mysterious Christian sect of Herrnhut, is called die schöne Seele. The Herrnhut sect resembles Joachimite community of saints who live as if the world already matured into its latter days, and the reality is ripe for the approaching end, having completed the apocalyptic process of fructificatio temporis, the fructification of time. While Goethe describes the angelic beautiful soul in a positive manner, she teaches Wilhelm the bliss of the heavenly love, the highest form of sublimation, Hegel casts her untimely angelism as the source of evil. To behave as if the world were already ripe and fully transformed, while it is obviously not the case, is to be out of time, unzuzeitig, willfully failing out of the temporal line, and because of that, worse than useless. The beautiful soul, already fulfilled in its moral perfection, feels exiled from the yet untransformed world and takes the position of a judging outsider. Whether it is religious or political variant, the beautiful soul is inactive. She withdraws from action in the world, which does not leap up to her high ethical standards by refusing to compromise them with the real and make her hands dirty. Hegel opposes the beautiful soul to men of action. Unlike the Puritans of moral consciousness who stay pure, external, and because of that inactive, the restless doers eagerly jump on the horse of history, but pay for it with ethical compromises which immediately become an easy target of the judgment. According to Hegel, judgment is a counter-empowerment of what he calls the souls in exile, not to act, not to create, but to negate. This counterpower a priori sentences all who act, all men of action, to the role of the criminals. In the counterworld of pure judgment, all action is contaminated, impure, and because of that, sinful. So Hegel says, beautiful soul lives in dread of besmirching the splendor of its inner being by action and an existence. And in order to preserve the purity of its heart, it flees from contact with the actual world. Already in phenomenology of spirit, this opposition has a clear socio-historical dimension. while the paradigmatic man of action, Napoleon, the reason on the horse, the new anima mundi, belongs to the French nation, which at the end of the 18th century became a favorite vessel for the spirit, so Hegel. The beautiful souls are the German romantics and high moralists, to whom the world of activity is as distant as it was for Immanuel Kant himself, forever stuck in the provincial Königsberg. A similar diagnosis echoing Hegel emerged in Michael Löwy's Elective Affinities, which described the condition of the German assimilated Jewry, officially included but actually excluded, as the natural hotbed for breeding a new generation of angry, beautiful souls. Angry because forced to inactivity against their will. For this generation, the 1918 death of Gustav Landauer, the Jewish martyr of the Bavarian Revolution, became a kind of an iconic memento. Unable to act in the society and change it from within, the quasi-assimilated Jewry, willing to participate in their host societies, but constantly reminded of the parochial Jewishness, clung to the most universally recognizable remnant of the Jewish legacy, the apocalyptic Last Judgment. In this manner, the position of the marginal pariah could be glorified into a transcendent vantage point of social critique. According to Jakob Tauber's Occidental Eschatology, the Jewish sources of the apocalypse came thus to the fore particularly strongly in the interwar Weimar period and sealed the association of the late modern Jewish thought with the absolutist position of severe judgment. This Standort, judging worldly things severely and absolutely from the perspective of redemption, from Karl Kraus through Theodor Adorno's famous finale of Minima Moralia, to Emmanuel Levinas's praise of strict exteriority, obviously produced wonders of critical theory, but it also had its dangers, well spotted by Hegel 1 century before. By connecting the exilic marginality, exteriority with transcendence, it created a blueprint for the judgment as the ultimate messianic reversal of the most excluded into the counter-powerful that would now mercilessly oppose the societal powers with the force of judgment alone, from without and as absolute outsiders, not through action, which was made impossible, but only through judging, by perceiving things as they should be in the relentless absolutist perspective, but without practical means to bridge the gap between Sollen and Sein. When it comes to what Taubes named the Jewish sources of judgment, no one explains, but also defends them better than Levinas. In the preface to Totality and Infinity, he famously opposes Hegel, described almost verbatim after Benjamin as the mystic of violence of the worst kind that there is, and his idea of judgment by history with the eschatological notion of judgment. This beyond the totality and objective experience is, however, not to be described in a purely negative fashion. It is reflected within the totality and history within experience. The eschatological, as the beyond of history, draws beings out of the jurisdiction of history and the future. It arouses them in and calls them forward to their full responsibility. Submitting history as a whole to judgment, exterior to the very wars that mark its end, it restores to each instant its full signification in that very instance. The eschatological notion of judgment, contrary to the judgment of history in which Hegel wrongly saw its rationalization, implies that beings have an identity before eternity. The eschatological vision breaks with the totality of wars and empires in which one does not speak. The experience of morality does not proceed from this vision, it consummates this vision. Ethics is an optics. The last sentence echoes closely Adorno's finale of Minima Moralia, where it is also the eschatological light of the standpoint of redemption which ultimately allows to see things of the world as they truly are in the critical perspective. The messianic light of lights creates a sphere of an ethical visibility, optics, as the precondition of the right judgment. But despite its ethical pathos, this vision also spells dangers. By defending against the relativization of history written by the victors, the infinitizer may also be accused of faring no better. His own suprahistorical form of last judgment risks an even more severe absolutization of a merely historical perspective, the one of exile. Another, but not at all lessened danger, derives from the unlivable irreality of the otherworldly standard of perfection, which, when rigorously applied, inevitably leads to the apocalyptic death wish for the fallen world in its totality. Pereat mundus, sed fiat justitia. Let the world perish, so that justice may triumph, even at the expense of the whole being. Levinas is well aware that the charge of beautiful souls was levied not only against the German romantics reveling in their impassivity, but also against the Jews, especially those living in the diaspora that is in a certain distance from the hosting states, as he calls it, which, on Levinas' account, constitutes precisely the distance necessary for judgment. In his critical essay on Zionism and the Israeli state politics, Levinas staunchly defends the pure interiority of the Jewish Exile that serves as the external point of judging. Already the place, or the diaspora, or the migrations of the Jewish people among the nations, its antiquity as one people across the diverse and contradictory periods of history, should call into question the excluding nature of political conceptualization. Interiority is perhaps simply this, an interiority that would no longer be the imaginary dimension of beautiful souls, should no doubt be measured in terms of this antiquity, whether it is founded on fidelity to memories or a book. A fidelity that encourages, certainly, but more surely denotes an impassiveness in the face of world's clamorous outbursts, its wars, glories, and hegemonies. This guarantees that in the melee of many events, hypothetical imperatives do not conceal their conditioning nor impose themselves categorically. This represents an ethical destiny, one without anachoresis or isolation, the distance necessary for judgment. It is the difficult freedom of Israel, which is not to be treated as an ethnographic curiosity, but as one extreme limit of human potential. Such a potential disturbs and irritates the awareness of sovereignty that is assumed by well-settled nations firmly installed on their lands. Basically, what Hegel rejects, Levinas affirms. The whole essay on Zionism is constructed as an implicit polemic with the Hegelian critique of the beautiful soul. Levinas defends the impassiveness of a diasporic distance as allowing for a categorical judgment that makes all historical judgments subordinate to the worldly melee of action and realpolitik, merely hypothetical and relative. The difficult freedom of Israel, here emphatically conceived not as the Israeli state, but its diasporic opposite, the Isaiah Sherit, the remnant that went on to live among the nations, consists precisely in defending the distant sensibility of the unhappy consciousness, never fully reconciled with this war and its idolatrous reality, egoism. The state of Caesar reaches its apogee, or a state of hypertrophy that is in some sense natural, without any hindrance to its growth, developing from the form it received from the Greco-Roman world, the pagan state, jealous of its sovereignty. As such, it separates humanity from its deliverance. Unable to exist without adoring itself, it is pure idolatry. In a world of scruples and of respect for man derived from monotheism, the chancellery, with its real politics, comes from another universe, sealed off from sensibility, or protest by beautiful souls, or tears shed by an unhappy consciousness. The last passage, openly anti-Hegelian, chimes also well with the damning vision of the koinon, or the corrupt realm of pagan idolatrous power, which emerged in yet another Jewish, or rather Christian Jewish apocalypse, the one of John of Patmos. For the righteous, the totality of the political world appears so conquering, imperialist, totalitarian, oppressive, that it fully separates humanity from its deliverance. It is either it, or it is either it, the real political world, or the redemption. Nothing of the koinon will enter the latter. This is what John Patmos says. If the world is to be redeemed, it first has to be judged and found wanting in its entirety. At the bottom of each apocalyptic theopolitics, therefore, there always lurks a radical Gnostic negation, which calls for the abstinence from every form of acting as merely strengthening the powers of the ontological status quo. This is what Hegel senses in his analysis of the beautiful soul. What truly motivates her is the Gnostic apology of absolute passivity, coupled with the right to absolute judgment. If the beautiful soul were ever to act, she would immediately unleash the ultimate Furie der Zerstörung, the fury of destruction, and bring about the apocalyptic end to the world. Short of this, she prefers to remain inactive and, by judging, destructive towards the world in a figure. Her judgment is a threatening anticipation of what she would do to the world if she only could. The violence, therefore, is not only on the side of the sovereign Realpolitik or Hegel, as Benjamin or Levinas seem to imply. It is also there in the exilic recesses of the unhappy consciousness, which often mistakes her revenge on the world for an ethical intransigence, as indeed reflected in the violent slogan of Pereat Mundus, sed fiat justitia, so beloved by Kant and so strongly opposed by Hegel. Levinas' primacy of ethics as not only prior to, but also free from the pressures of what he calls ontologism, or the inevitably biased and interested interesse being in the world, constitutes an extreme version of the exilic thinking. An exile so extreme that it results in being exiled from the world. Here, the sense of non-participation in existence is so radical that it produces a standard of absolute exteriority transcendence, achievable only by the pure interiority of the beautiful outsider, from which the whole of being can be judged and found irreparably wanting. The accusatory question of the beautiful soul, is it righteous to be, can thus only be answered in negative. No, it is not. To be just is to be in the position of the subject who withdraws from being in order to question the totality of ontologism and forever clash with the existing I in the essentially unjust position of an object taking part in being and taking place at the cost of others. In its most radical version, Levinas' exilic ethics takes the Manichaean standpoint which preempts any dialectical solution. As such, it is a source of what he calls a constant unease. But this inconvenience is nonetheless secretly compensated by the jouissance of the absolute judgment, in which Levinas visibly relishes. The less I am in being, the more I can judge. According to Hegel, the Manichaean dualism is disastrous for ethics, but all the more so for politics, torn by two violent counterforces, the one of the apocalyptic judgment, firmly entrenched in its exilic exterior Standort, versus the one of realpolitik, which, condemned as irredeemably evil, takes the most monstrous form of the self-conscious and deliberate rejection of all ethical values. We know that what we do is wrong, but it must be done to solve the problem. Dualism is thus only apparently oppositional. The two forms of violence condition one another. The more severe becomes the judgment, feeding on the non-participatory position of the outsider, the more cruel the actual political action, which is doomed by a judgment a priori. Now, this is not an abstract rule. We know it from the Russian political theology, as well political practice, from the Tsarist samodzержавие, which is the Russian term for sovereignty, to its latest avatar in Vladimir Putin. We know it also well from Fyodor Dostoevsky, avidly read by young Levinas, a kind of ethico-political gnosis which, by condemning the men of action as inescapably corrupt, at the same time gives them a sovereign license to kill, to exercise cruelty as precisely what is expected of them in the evil land of ontologism. For, as rigidly opposed to the sphere of pure justice, politics cannot be other than essentially dirty. The men of action are the holy sinners who sacrifice their souls for the rest of the society that remains inactive and because of that can be saved. And if they are revered, it is precisely for their ethical sacrifice and cruel efficiency, like Putin, but also, at least for some in Israel, Netanyahu. In the worst possible scenario of such Gnostic politics, the very notion of moral action becomes a contradiction in terms. For it is either or, either morality, always pure and exterior, or action, always besmirched and too compromised to call upon ethical ideals. It is precisely this double bind of political gnosis which Derrida wishes to deconstruct in his polemical Adieu to Levinas, opting, not unlike Hegel, for a more dialectical position that will allow a possibility of a moral action. While Levinas is closer to those early apocalyptic visionaries who cultivated the righteousness of historical bystanders, Derrida is closer to Philo, an exilic thinker who claimed that one has to participate in the culture of others, truly disseminate in the world if one wants to influence it with the law of Zion. Derrida takes this rule of participation even further, to the point of becoming a self-conscious Marano, a Jew who risks his traditional identity in order to, as he claims, become even more Jewish, that is to fulfill the ethical diasporic mission. While Levinas believes that one must be out in order to be able to criticize, Derrida, led by his Marano choice, believes the opposite. You had to be in order to exercise the right to the critique. Contamination is everywhere, he claims, meaning that the ideal of pure justice must be necessarily betrayed if it is to be operative in the conditions of the real. It is precisely the betrayal, what he calls the perjury of absolute justice, which becomes a necessary mediation between the heavenly and the earthly Jerusalem, the transcendent realm of the ideal of justice without being, as in Levinas, and the immanent realm of the living, who must follow the conatus in order to survive. Now you have a long quote from Derrida that explains the necessity of betrayal, and let me just finish with the conclusion. Sorry, the paper is too long. To be just, according to Derrida, is not to be only able to judge. It is most of all to be able to act. While defending the world's right to be and the possibility of moral action in it, despite all the world's weakness and moral fallibility, over against the too good to be ideal of absolute justice, Derrida comes actually closer to the tolerant spirit of the rabbis than Levinas himself, at least in this most extreme variant which I just reconstructed. In the commentary on Genesis, dealing with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, rabbis imagine Abraham reproaching God and saying to him, "You desire the world and you desire absolute justice. Take one or the other. You cannot hold the cord and both ends at once." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agata, for this consideration of the beautiful soul. I think it's an interesting genealogy. Nitzan, the floor is yours.
This is mine.
No, that's mine. That's yours.
So first of all, thank you very much, Elad and Gilad, Shaul, Agatha, and Amir, and of course our host. I cannot see here Stefan. The paper I'm going to share with you today is based on the new book that Amir mentioned, which is coming in January about German Jewish time. It's called Homo Temporalis. Those of you who know Hannah Arendt know where that comes from. But I want to ask, to start with a question which bothers me greatly this past year, since October 7th, and that is how to think about Hebrew in the current state, how to think about a language that participates now in mass killing, and how to think about a language that I feel very uncomfortable speaking in an affirmative way these days. And not by coincidence, I chose, when I thought about the question of exile, to go back to that question in the way my topic, German Jewish thinkers, considered that, and that is trying to think about the core of language and maybe a way to rethink it, or rethink its assumptions. And they start, and I want to try to take their model as an experiment to think with. By thinking about language in time, Hebrew in time, and how Hebrew acts in time in different ways. And of course, Galut v'Medina, or exile and state, are two of the key concepts of thinking about the language in that context. So let's start with a minor assumption. Exile, and I apologize, I'm going to read a lot from the paper, something I do not usually do, but it's really important for me to keep the order in that case and to stick to that. Exile is a temporal state. In the Bible, Israel is punished for its sins by being dispersed. Defitz Adonai, Deuteronomy 4, losing its land, Avadetem haaretz hatova, Deuteronomy 11, scattered among the nations, Efitzcha Adonai, Bechol ha'amim, Deuteronomy 28. This is the part of the Deuteronomist tradition, as we know. But there's always a prophecy of consolation return to that notion of dispersal and scattering. Exile is also a repeating event in Jewish tradition. The Talmud discusses exile starting maybe with Egypt, if we talk about the chronology of exilic events. Its length and its speed of reaching there, part of the Talmudic discussion, Merkavot HaKodesh lo yachlu litma'ameh. Historically, the first actual exile, the Babylonian one, is periodized between 586 to 538. The second started after Roman occupation 70 AD, as we know, and ended with, some would argue, the Zionist return in the 20th century. Exile, as historians discussed it, entails a dialectical relation. Galut in Hebrew is a temporary banishment, but it also has a process, it also incorporates a dialectical process of exposure, discovery, and penance. What is exposed in exile, what is discovered when living among the nations, this is part of Jeremiah's and then St. Paul question. In Buber and Levinas's terms, we'd say that the sanctioned self discovers the other, and that its own world of references, space, God, Jerusalem, self, collective, must be redefined when one lives in exile. If this is indeed the case, then exile, galut, can take place in an internal as also internal exile, or as exile, as the historian Israel Bartal and more recently Nono, who's sitting here, are considering even within the state of Palestine, of Israel, when different communities live together and in some proximity and rethink the very assumptions of their language vis-a-vis each other, and are able to defamiliarize maybe some of the basic assumptions of one's own identity. German Jewish thinkers, my topic, were the first to historicize, then historiosophize exile in the 19th century. From Moses Mendelssohn to Salomon Maimon to the exceptional group of historians belonging to the Wissenschaft des Judentums, and beyond, many writers in Jewish periodicals started using compound nouns such as, I'm going to mention now a few German terms that they used, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, such as Zeitlage, condition of time, Zeitfrage, question of time, Zeitbetrachtung, observation of time, Jetzeit, which we know later from Benjamin, present time, now time, and Zeitsche, the damage of time, the damaging time, often in connection to historians such as David Myers and Yael Zubovel show the dialectics of state and exile, settlement and wandering, the wandering Jew. All of these terms, as Niels Romer has showed, I quote from him, highlight the obsession, quote, with the present moment, with the present time. Moreover, time was increasingly accelerated and hence appeared as a stormy movement. Indeed, with the failure of assimilation, the rise of racialized nationalism and anti-Semitism, German Jewish thinkers and historians entered modern history in a storm. The spread of temporal terms, then, is tightly connected to the rise of historiosophy. Recent historians started discussing the 19th century and the start of the new era, the age of steam engines, and the rise of a new consciousness of time recently. The historians, for example, Stephen Kern and Anson Rabinbach, were talking about the temporal turn that took place during the 19th century. Christopher Clark, more recently, moved it a little further and showed that in the early 1900s, we witnessed a temporal turn that, quote, broke with all precedents, rejecting the very idea of history itself. The philosopher Alan Manslow writes on a modern, quote, temporal turn from real time as it culturally understood a narrated history of time. Those of you who know Sarit Katan-Gribatz and Lynn Kay, our recent article about the temporal turn in Jewish studies, and this is one of the key points I want to raise here. What is the temporal turn in Jewish studies? Explain how Jewish studies experience in the present a, quote, return, hyphenated, return, to areas of research that had been of interest to previous generations of Jewish studies scholars, and that have gained momentum from the understanding stemming from the 1900s that, quote, time is a conception that is itself continually constructed, relative, and local, as well as the present notion of that time, quote unquote, is running out. German Jewish thinkers who inspired the idea of Jewish historical consciousness and Jewish studies were deeply mindful of temporal concepts and regarded exile as central one. Gershom Scholem, who considered himself a cultural Zionist and rejected both assimilation and political Zionism, right, described the very essence of Jewish language as exilic and one of temporal deferral. Scholem spoke, quote, on the infinite character of language with its, again, quote, positive expression of being. Infinity, he says, resides in the two bordering lands of the revealed and the silenced. And I think within that notion of deferral of the Hebrew, we can hear both that kind of dialectic relation between exile and state, between the two states of revealed, what is revealed and what is silenced. According to Scholem, this non-spatial border between the revealed and the silenced is the differentia specifica of Jewish languages in exile, specifically Hebrew. Gershom Scholem wrote those words in the context of his and Walter's Benjamin critique, which is not, this is not usually considered, but specifically their critique of Martin Buber and Martin Buber's support of the First World War and his plea of two Zionists to volunteer and join the German warfare. And what Benjamin and Sholem criticize in that specific context is not just the militant rhetoric of Buber, but in fact the philosophical connection, linear connection to Verwirklichung, so realization, the notion of action, right, in his philosophy. Jewish, theological and liturgical, and Zionist historiography, territorial, we just heard about Shlilat HaGalut, right? Or autonomous, as we see in Buber, viewed exile as a moving point in space revolving around the sun, Jerusalem, of course. From Shimon Dubnov to Yitzhak Ber and Ben Zion Dinur, historians of Zionism debated the question of continuity between biblical times and the Promised Land, exile, and return to Zion. More recent trends in historiography, especially since the 1990s, discussed exile in relation to history and memory. Amnon Raz-Krakotzkin wrote about the in his acclaimed Jewish Memory Between Exile and History that, quote, the attempt to narrate the exilic past of the Jews as autonomous and as continuous actually stands in opposition to the main and common perception embodied in the concept, which rejects the existence of any meaningful history. Reconsidering the debate between Yerushalmi and Funkenstein about Jewish historical consciousness, Nono advocated that, quote, accepting the modern perception of history means, in essence, accepting Christian and Zionist triumphalist narratives. Historians Sivian Goldberg, Tamar Rudavsky, and Elisheva Karlbach, to mention just a few, indeed revised this narrative by showing the mutual impact of Jewish, Christian, and very often Islamic calendars on each other. My own argument in this paper is divided into then 3 brief points. 1, the German Jewish thinkers from Buber, who talks about realization and the road to realization always mediated via Erlebnis, the experience, immediate experience of life, via Benjamin, who's talking about Jetztzeit and discusses the dialectics of Erlebnis and Erfahrung, the long and short-term experiences, Arendt, who's talking about natality, as we know, and Celan, who I'm going to end with, who talks about Atemwende, the breath turn, realized that focusing on time rather than space takes teleology, both historical and theological, out of the equation. So that's, quote, argument number 1. 2, that focusing on the temporal aspect exposes, discovers, as we mentioned, the most egalitarian element of existence, human life, and that human life stands above and beyond any personal or collective framework. 3, argument number 3, from this angle, when many scholars within Jewish studies support the exiling and destruction of a supposed enemy, and when exile is becoming a global phenomena that redefines the relationship between South and North, exile, I think, and we should consider here, I think, that notion should be redefined and reconsidered. So the very notion of exile within Jewish studies and then the legitimacy we give it within Jewish studies should be, I think, questioned. Second part, I want to focus now on German Jewish notion of in-betweenness, of temporality, and then narrow that down even further into Paul Celan's discussion of that. So historians of German Jewry favor the notion of in-betweenness, dual identity, deterritorialization, to quote a few of the best-known historians and depictions of German Jewish culture. But such concepts are negative characterization of space, not positive analysis of time, right? Deterritorialization means you weigh things against the territory. In-betweenness means there are 2 points. To the space, you consider yourself standing in between, right? Those of you who know the bridges metaphor in Prague. A closer look at their language demonstrates that despite their varied intellectual background, German Jewish thinkers during the 20th century were united in choosing the concept of time rather than space as the key to theorizing their individual and collective experience. Avraham Yoshua Heschel concluded that Israel, quote, is a people of time, Volk der Zeit, and that Judaism is a religion of time. Jacob Taubes proposed, quote, that Israel was able to become a people without a space, Volk ohne Raum. Vivian Liske has pointed out more recently that the basis of Scholem's understanding, to go back to our notion of deferral of Jewish existence in exile, was his stress on lament, or the notion that Jewish language rests on the new temporality of deferral that is, quote, the deferral in the word, the linguistic principle of lament. A deferral implies a suspense of decisionist language. This is Sholem now, right? Rephrased by Vivian Liska. So the suspense of decisionist language, the suspense of sovereign norms, and an attempt to cut out into the progressive idealist course that leads from an idea to realization, as mentioned vis-a-vis Buber. Sholem's understanding of the inherent deferral of Hebrew is a sibling to Benjamin's quote-unquote dialectics, not quote, just quote, dialectics at a standstill and Kafka's immobile assault, stehender Sturmlauf, end quote, an intense movement that does not progress, stays itself, and leaves everything unchanged. Franz Rosenzweig understood the Hebrew language as, quote, always in the time flow, Zeitfluss, between the already schon, still, noch, and no longer, nicht mehr, as the great unrests in the clock of world history. Here, Rosenzweig argued, the language of the prophets is still in the making. It does not let the past rest, either by merely saying that it was. The purpose of Between Us here was not only to keep an interpretative live connection open to Jewish scripture, but also to propose a political alternative to the Christian imperialist narrative. And we see that with Buber and Rosenzweig's translation of the Bible. Although scholars debate to what degree Christian terminology informed Rosenzweig's discussion of creation, revelation, and redemption, they agree that the melding of Jewish and Christian notions of life via Hegel and Nietzsche inspired Rosenzweig to see human life as the not yet infinite, for what matters is the meeting of different time frames where their world become fully alive. Rosenzweig's negative theology and Sholem's critical historiography were the opposite of triumphalist eschatology, Hegelian world history, and the vulgar social Darwinist struggle for life in the Lebensraum. Instead, German Jewish thinkers committed to a constant failure, quote, such as Sholem's lament, or Benjamin's view of history as one single catastrophe. For Buber and Rosenzweig, Benjamin and Sholem, Arndt and Celan, decadence and degeneration were signs of culmination of a 19th century belief in linear progress. Whether in support of the Zionist or the German cause, Walter Benjamin wrote dismissively of Buber's intense interest in realization, and of German Jewish Zionists who, I quote from Benjamin's letter to Sholem, German Jewish Zionists who make propaganda for Palestine and then get drunk like Germans. Third part, Celan. The fusion of temporal principles and political philosophy was part of a German Jewish counter-movement to reconstitute an alternative temporality within given spatial boundaries. Martin Buber reshaped religious studies on the basis of an immediate, unmittelbar dialogue between self and other that rejected the category of the nation. He says, everyone must come out of exile in their own way. The way means Erlebnis, the living experience. In 1,000 years of its exile, Jewry says, yearned for the land of Israel, not as a nation like others, he wrote, but as a fulfillment of Judaism. A fulfillment within motives and intentions which cannot be derived wholly from the category nation. Benjamin was talking about a linguistic exile, not only in relation to the German state, but also in relation to Zionism. Arendt, as we know, wrote about statelessness, exile, and migration, or, following Bernard Lazare, the para in contrast to Un Pauvre Venu, the social climber. For Paul Celan, as the poet and translator Durs Grunbein argues, language itself constitutes exile. All of these thinkers identified exile with a temporal rather than spatial existence. I know I hammered that down, but I want to keep the threads coherent. All of them identified exile as a temporal rather than spatial existence, and with life as an egalitarian category. For Celan, poetic syntax has the power of fundamental breath turn, a comma or a temporal break, an interval or caesura between the German and the Jewish, the Christian and the Jew, memory and nothingness. Following his German Jewish peers, Celan's poetical oeuvre was dedicated to the development of a new syntax and vocabulary, generating neologisms such as ones that fuse German, Hebrew, and Yiddish, for example, within the boundaries of a given language, German. In contrast to the Heideggerian temporality, which he saw as projecting a modern German back into the mythic past of Sein, or Sein, right, the being with a Y, Heimat, Volk, Stadt, Gestalt, being homeland, people, state, whole. For Celan, the movement was between languages, between past and present, between existent and potential, but never spatial. His poetry is usually structured around a living word of memory that functions as a particular signifier for what is missing in the present. His is a different not yet from Heidegger's understanding of being towards death, as the not yet being dead, or the Dasein, das factically as long as it exists. And Agata is speaking beautifully about that in one of our articles. Celan's intervals are never singular or mythic, even when he refers to mythic symbols. It's never self-affirmative. Rather, they turn his senses into a language of time and memory of loss. There can be no poetry after Auschwitz, to use again the dictum, the well-known dictum, without Paul Celan's understanding of nearness. But nearness for him is never in space, it's always a point in time, which Celan equates with a breath turn, again Atemwende, or the moment between life and death. The poem he argues in the Meridian Speech 1961, I quote from the Meridian Speech now, ceaselessly calls and holds itself back from its now no longer into its still now. Es ruft und holt sich und ausgesetzt aus seinem schon nicht mehr in sein immer noch zurück. In other words, German Jewish thinkers saw the temporality of life as a primary force that could overcome difference and distinct identities. By separating the temporality of life from a spatial and normative sense of belonging, those thinkers worked against the absolute principle of sovereignty. Instead, they suggested turning the exception into the norm and transforming the stranger, the immigrant, the Jew, the pariah, the Muslim, the Musulman, into a dynamic principle for political reform. How long do I have?
4 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to skip a more theoretical discussion here that refers from a contemporary discussion following Achille Mbembe and Mamdani and Derrida and Agamben, and I want to jump straight into the poem so we have something specific really to consider. The best demonstration of Celan's unique understanding of German Jewish breath turn is obvious in one of Celan's best known poems, Near, the nearness, right, proximity, in Aorta's Arch, closing the aortic arch. And you can see both the German and the English on the screen. I'll skip the German, I'll just read the English translation, but focus on the second stanza also in the German, because Celan is doing there an interesting play between German and Yiddish. Closing in the aortic arch, this is, by the way, John Felsiner's translation. Closing the aortic arch in the bright blood, the bright word. Mother Rachel, Mama Rachel, weeps no more. Carried across all that was wept. Quiet in the coronary arteries, unconstricted, ziv, that light. Celan's poem describes a sick body during its last breaths of life and follows the medical process of dying in the first stanza. Those of you who do not know that anecdotal biographical point, Celan actually studied medicine and used medical transcripts when he wrote some of his poems. The process follows the logic of tzimtzum, or the gradual narrowing of life to its most fundamental singular essence. Notes in Celan's Marginalia show he was referring to Gershom Scholem and Martin Heidegger's interpretation of those traditions, as well as to a modern Yiddish interpretation of the canonical liturgical reference, Mother Rachel weeps no more. Those of you who know the liturgical the prayer. The allusion refers to a Jewish prayer that is borrowed from Jeremiah 31, and that became the best-known liturgical piece referring to Jewish exile. Quote, a voice is heard in Ramah, Kol Barama, Kol Nehi Barama, mourning and great weeping, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. The Jewish Midrash debates the power of the lament, but agrees it should be framed within the context of return to Zion. In contrast, the poem changes the focus of the prophecy of destruction to its aftermath, and from mourning to the silence that follows it. Celan jotted down this passage in the margins. Those of you, I spent a few weeks in Marbach in the archive and found that scribbled on one of Gershom Scholem's, the core of it, on Gershom Scholem's book in handwriting, in Celan's handwriting. On the margins of book by Gershom Scholem, where Scholem framed the prayer as a key to the discussion of Kabbalist Tzimtzum and Messianic redemption. Celan's quote-unquote vertical, that's how Pierre Joris is talking about him, Celan's vertical allusion to Jeremiah's prophecy of destruction is a bitter one, for the poem's endpoint is not consolation or redemption, as usually the prayer goes. The only consolation is the individual's own moment of death. Indeed, the third and final stanza casts a critical eye on the physiological and mystical concentration of the body. In the third stanza, Celan alludes to the opening line of the poem, closing the aortic arch, but this time stresses the temporal moment, not the spatial category close that is present in the first line. In the first line of the third stanza, nearness is transformed into a moment of stillness before death, quiet in the coronary arteries. With the final line, Ziv, jenes Licht, that light, the poem invokes Ziv, a mystical Hebrew term that means glow, that often marks the glow of secret, mystical realization, Glanz in German. Those of you who know the reference from another poem in Paul Celan, Tenebrae, which refers to the Christian prayer. To the Hebrew word, Celan adds the German literal explanation and indication that light. The most important element in this concluding line, and I'm coming to my conclusion, is the comma that separates and connects the Hebrew and the German, Ziv, jenes Licht. The mystical and the physiological, the Jewish and the Christian. The comma is itself a syntactical representation of the breath turn. The choice of the jenes, rather than the more obvious dieses, implies a displacement of light, and thus the action of reaching towards the light over there, rather than here. Both choices demonstrate how the syntax of German Jewish life marks the end of one world, the dying body, and the beginning of another, that light. Indeed, this is a poetic form of what wants to reach through time, and its touch is simultaneously warm and cold, animated and spectral. If Celan's last line leads us back to the first, shaping his familiar loop form, it also shows us the way out, one last deep breath before turning the page. And with that, 2 lines and I'm done. Conclusion. What does our discussion of state and exile meet in the present, and what can we draw from examples such as Celan or German Jewish thinkers? The German Jewish thinkers I'm discussing in my work are considered the leaders of sub-disciplines in Jewish studies. Religion studies with Buber, critical thinking Benjamin, political philosophy Arendt, Jewish literature Celan, etc. Yet their own discussion is limited to the temporal turn of the 19th century. In Men in Dark Times, Arendt discusses the linguistic impossibility or the hell of German Jewish letters. In The Arcades, Benjamin called to expound the 19th century. But isn't it time for us now to expound not just the 19th century of those thinkers, but the 20th century into our own? Dipesh Chakrabarty, the post-colonial thinker and now one of the historians of the Anthropocene, explained in a recent interview, I quote, "German Jewish thought informs my thinking in many ways. My critique of the empty notion of time owes a direct and major debt to Walter Benjamin's most important piece of writing, Thesis on the Philosophy of History." And Chakrabarty goes to discuss Kafka and Arendt. What Benjamin, Arendt and Kafka taught him, he says, is the understanding that thinking as an exilic minority is not just an alternative to chauvinistic thinking in national terms. Rather, he says, the geobiological history of the planet makes us realize that we humans are a minority form of life and that the majority form of life on the planet is not ours. Once we can see ourselves as a minority form of life among many others, Lebensformen, a term Buber, by the way, talks about in 1913 already, our very understanding of time, history, and self changes. This realization, Chakrabarty explains, calls on us to develop minoritarian forms of thinking with regard to other forms of life. I'd like to conclude here by suggesting that thinking about minority, thinking as a minority form of life, means thinking about our time in this, that is, nowadays, dark world, from the perspective of both a minority and a comma. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We started the panel with Goethe and we ended with Celan. I think our course in Introduction to German Literature is almost done. The floor is open for questions, comments, responses, kushiot. Elad, please.
Thank you both. I have a question for both. You think we meist brauchen das for the audience? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Weil sonst.
Thanks. Thank you. So, quick question for Agata. Levinas was Zionist. He even, and I'm also that I'm not so sure. Even in some of his writings, you could extract the position that I think you were criticizing of this kind of aloofness of the entire being is unjust and justice needs to destroy being. I think in his Jewish writings he's very often criticizing precisely these beautiful souls and in support of Israeli politics.
I know.
Very specifically of the conquest, he speaks about Yeshua bin Nun. So I just wonder how your perspective explains, relates to his very concrete support of the state. So that's for Agata and to Nitzan. Just a thought. There is this entire imperial turned into reading different strands of thought, but specifically German Jewish thinkers, not so less in the national context, but in the imperial context. So, Yoni Feller just has a book on Lebovic, in the imperial imagination, and so forth. And I'm just, provocatively, okay, a people without a land, indeed, in a sense, detached itself from a national perspective, but in the same, it also gives, not necessarily, but may also give access to an imperial understanding. So how do you, how do you see that? Would you also read, see your readings that you offer in this perspective? Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Elad. Of course, I am aware that he was a Zionist. After all, I was quoting from his serious message on so-called Zionisms, right? And he was very much interested in what he called a kind of a continuation of Sholom's project of Messianic Zionism. But I think that there was a major contradiction in Levinas, a huge contradiction of which he never actually gave a proper account. Derrida was onto something in his two essays on Adieu to Levinas, especially the second one, where he basically implied that Levinas' form of Zionism, especially the one that came to the fore in his famous interview with Alain Finkielkraut, was just a bad form of betrayal of his very kind of extreme form of exilic ethics based on pure interiority, what he called pure interiority. And why was it a bad betrayal, as opposed to what Derrida would call dialectically a better betrayal? Because this is the moment, I think you remember it, when Levinas is asked by Finkielkraut, but how come you are the thinker of alterity, of radical alterity? Wouldn't be the Palestinian coming to you and showing your face with precisely this kind of a ger, this kind of a stranger that you are supposed to respond ethically? And then Levinas answers, and this is a really bad betrayal of his exilic extreme form of ethics, by saying, oh, no, the neighbor, my kin, is also the other. in that case, I'm following the ethics of the kin. And this is simply the contradiction, right? This is the contradiction. It is not something that can be dialectically glossed over. And this is, unfortunately, my paper was too long, but I wanted to tell you what a kind of a better betrayal could look like when explained by Derrida, who basically claims that, okay, we can even keep those beautiful ideals of unlivable heavenly Jerusalem as Levinas presents them, but we shouldn't call yet it ethics. The ethics only begins, I quote Derrida, with moral action. When there is no action, when there is only a space of pure judgment, we don't yet deal with ethics or justice. So I only wanted to present this very extreme form of exilic ethics, where you feel truly exiled from being, following this old apocalyptic mode of, the Jewish radical thinkers who actually were exactly, they felt that they only exist in time. That is actually something that bridges our presentations very well, because in the Apocalypse of Baruch, when the God reveals to the exiled ones the mythos of time, he basically tells them, and now you will only live in time, because you'll be exiled from the world, exiled from being. In defending Hegel a little bit against the company of Adorno, Benjamin, and Levinas, I basically wanted also to remind of the possible dangers of such extremely exilic ethics, where you also feel exiled from space, from the world, from being, and then located only in time.
Thank you, Elad. I'm obviously concerned, and I'll answer it. There are different ways to answer that. Disciplinary, theoretical. I want to actually answer it personally, because I think many of the people sitting here grew up, and I know many of my teachers are sitting here, so grew up with a generation where German Jewish thought was the radical edge, right? I was introduced to thinking about non-Zionism or the critique of Zionism by reading Benjamin, or by reading some of the people here, talking about Benjamin and Arendt, and there are certain panels I'm thinking now, looking at some of the faces of the people sitting here, knowing that these were turning points for me growing up within that progressive camp. And to a degree, we're coming now, I think, to the point where that progressive camp fails, doesn't hold. We started talking about the demonstrations in Israel, which to me mark a point of failure, not success, of that language. And therefore, the need to reevaluate what that language actually does, and where it goes against its own ethical principles, as if, norms, right? And I'll just say one thing, which is it's interesting to me that many of the thinkers that I'm thinking now with, who are again at the most radical end, still go back to those thinkers to try and figure out what to do in political theory, what to do with political thought in the present, and trying to release themselves from this generation, right? And I think sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully. What I was engaged with or trying to understand in that respect is two things. One is the internal differentiation between some of these thinkers who are more loyal to cultural Zionism, Buber and Scholem, and the group like Arendt and Benjamin, who try to distance themselves from it and try to understand where that radical turn actually leads. So that's one way to distinguish or find our language within that, voice within that. Another one is say the whole thing actually collapsed, right? And I think some of the questions I'm raising myself about my own discipline nowadays, about my own thinking, is I've been studying and teaching Jewish studies now for 20 years. And I don't think it holds. I think part of it now must be reframed as a discipline. And I think we, in some way, and I hope that this conference here will allow us to reconsider some of these options, potentials, where to go from here. But I think that, and that's why I raised the question about expounding the 19th century, now expounding maybe the 20th into something that is completely different, ending with a voice like Chakrabarti. And I expected, I don't know if that will come up, I thought maybe, you know, some people will see it as a way to avoid the subject. Because when you go too far into, you know, suggesting open potentials, you avoid the actual subject. I think that the point is the opposite, but I'll stop here.
Yeah. Thank you for both talks. Mostly to Nitzan and mostly to the, I think it goes well with what you said. Don't know if it agrees or not. Probably it doesn't agree, but it goes well with that. The question, there are a few things. First, and just the poem by Celan, and the immediate reference to Sholem, which I think here, when you want to open the question of what Jewish studies should be, you have to remember that Celan, and especially here in this poem, Mutter Rachel is Mame Ruchel. It's like the Galicianer, all of this tradition, it's like the Maria. The whole song here is about Maria and Mame Ruchel, yeah? Or the old poem, sorry. It's the immediate translation into the upper class Lutheran Jewish studies of Sholem is excluding all of these possibilities that perhaps you are now referring to. Let me go to the next example. You referred to Nono, which, of course, I don't think there are many people I appreciate more than Nono, but he was not the first to discuss that, to discuss the possibility of exile inside the Holy Land. I think one person who did a lot of work on that was Rabbi Yoel Teitelboim, but again, Sholem excluded him not only as Sholem who admired Rabbi Kook and saw that he is one of the greatest mystics. He spoke about Teitelboim as ridiculous, nonsense, and so on. So when you talk about that, we perhaps have to include this issue. The last thing which goes in the same direction, when we speak about German Jewish thinkers, for me it's always difficult to listen, because not because of only Sholem, but because Maharam Rothenburg is also a Jewish thinker. Rabbi Akiva Eger is also a German Jewish thinker to an extent. But we got this Lutheran tradition which exclude, and not by mistake, exclude explicitly and intentionally a whole tradition that exists. Okay.
Thanks a lot, and these are really excellent questions. So I'm thinking about, Celan's, there are two anecdotes. One is of Sholem trying to read Celan and saying it's completely undecipherable. He didn't understand what that means. And the other one I'm thinking about is Celan, who corresponded for a very long time with Adorno, said to meet him, I think it was the first time, in Paris somewhere, and once he noticed Adorno coming into the restaurant, escaped through the bathroom window, which to me is a very good illustration of the difficult relationship there with those hegemonic voices within that generation. And the tension is there, you're completely right. I'll say just the following, which is, I think that the point about Sholem, well, two things. One is actually about Sholem's and Mame Rochel, which is connected. This is, so Celan, what Celan is doing here in a very intricate way, if you look at the second stanza, he constructs a neologism that is almost undecipherable for people who don't understand or don't know the tradition in Yiddish. because the Rübertragen is actually a play between the Yiddish and the German, and is a reference to Moshe Leib Halpern, Nacht poem. So and that's usually the way Celan is moving, right? He throws these coded hints, words that would send us into those rabbit holes of searching for a whole history, alternative history to the history we're telling, and then very often undercut it. And that's what he does here. And I think he does the same with Sholem. I think he does the same with Adorno. And I'll just refer, and with that, vis-a-vis Teitelbaum and the tradition you're talking about, you're completely right. I mean, of course, Celan is reading those people not seriously, not as seriously as he should have, because it's very often mediated by those German Jews. So he reads the Hasidic thinkers with me through the mediation of Buber, etc., etc. But there's an interesting story about Teitelbaum specifically and Rav Kook, which is Buber, Bergman, and Sholem were engaging with Rav Kook, the father, of course, not the son, right, early on, and admired him for the same reason actually Agata was talking about now, or kind of in relation to that, the Hegelian undertones behind Rav Kook, right? And they, on the one hand, admired his turn or his attempt to mix the two traditions, but on the other hand, really disliked the Hegelian undertone of it. And I think part of what the conflicted relation with Teitelbaum has to do also with that history, but we can talk about it more later.
Hi. Yeah, please. Gil?
It might be a version of Elad's question earlier, but my question is for Agata. For no particular reason, seeing the name of Finkelkraut on the screen made me wonder whether the relation between the ideal world and the real world that you invoked from Levinas produces any particular thoughts, particularly with regard to the critique of the state that we are talking about, when right now in the Jewish politics, if one may call it that way, in the Jewish politics of France, there is a very, very serious critique of the state. The state is in danger, and the state is not the friend of the Jews. Although some Jews seem to think that the Rassemblement National is going to be the friend of the Jews more than the so-called left. I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts in the name of the conversation that we're having. I wouldn't want to suggest that there's anything like, in fact, Jewish politics in France, but if there were, what would you have to say at this point?
Gosh, I don't really know much about Jewish politics in France, but
the debate was between two French intellectuals.
Yes, of course, yes, and Finkelkraut, yes, and Finkelkraut. Yeah, but as I said, I mean, Finkelkraut just basically was amazed by the amount of contradiction he witnessed in the dialogue with Levinas, and basically fell silent. I mean, that is Levinas basically begins to talk about the ethics of kinship as suddenly superior in case of Israel over the ethics of alterity. It's just basically the end of conversation. But maybe I don't know if I'm answering your question, but what I was gesturing at, which was an essentially Hegelian argument, was that there are enormous dangers of certain type of extreme exilic ethics that seems like very critical of sovereignty, but ends up and actually being coupled like a kind of a mutual completion or mutual conditioning with a kind of an implicit acceptance of absolute cruelty of realpolitik. So what seems like an open, absolute critique of the realpolitik of any kind of sovereignty, any kind of state sovereignty, implicitly ends in actually condoning the absolute cruelty or brutality of realpolitik, because there's no other way. And I think that in that sense, Levinas for me is a kind of a warning sign. If there is a French Jewish politics, I would like to be a politics. I would rather see it more developed in the Derridian vein. But this idea that sovereignty would indeed be conceived silently, as in Russian samodzержавие, as the kind of a realm of ontologism when you are licensed to do cruel things, or even expected to do cruel things, because from the point of pure ethics, it is pure evil. This I find incredibly dangerous, and I actually see it happening all over the world, in Russia, which is very truthful to basically this kind of a Gnostic model of sovereignty, but also suddenly spreading all over the world, right? Where we're dealing with this very warring dualism suddenly of people who are in the high morals and judge, right? But they somehow withdraw from any kind of a moral action into this position of beautiful souls because they don't see the possibility of actually acting, right? The actualization is blocked. And this kind of a implicit, very warring trend of actually seeing the world of actualization as inescapably evil, and even expected to be so. Expected to be so. This is why I thought that it's a high time to criticize Levinas' duplicity from the Hegelian point of view.
Danny concurs. We have 2 more minutes, I think. Another question, final question, perhaps. Where's the mic? And we have 1 more. So we'll just maybe pick up these both these questions together, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. Question to Nitzan. My question is simply, how could a notion of exile, which is only in time and not in space, be helpful for thinking about anything political?
It's for you.
Yeah. Thank you. My question is for Agata. I found your talk really interesting. I don't know if you've read Gillian Rose's essay on Levinas, but it reminded me so much of that because she's also critiquing him from a Hegelian perspective and accusing him of the same thing, although she wrote it in the 90s. So I think foreshadows this a lot. I was wondering, she also critiques Derrida from a similar standpoint, but she says that he lacks this Hegelian movement because in his refusal to recognize any kind of absolutes, it's sort of critique of pro-structuralism, he also fails to engage in the Hegelian dynamic. So I was wondering what you think of this critique and what exactly is this fire that you speak of? How do you really think Derrida is an answer to Levinas?
Okay, I'll answer very quickly because I think we're running out of time. This is a huge question, but I'll say the following, which is, I don't think, I am a political activist, and as a political activist, I think very often about the notion of acting within a space. But I'll say the following, which is I think the condition for acting inside a certain space must be temporal, because if you want to consider where you are grounded by norm, it usually is connected to spatial categories. That's where the norm usually binds you down and connects you to questions of specific identity, specific place, and linguistic norms. The most radical, when I'm trying to think about the most radical option for action, and I am thinking about action in that sense, that the political conditions of our time, the way I understand them, many people may disagree, but the way I understand them, have to do with questions of time, of temporality. And I ended not by coincidence with someone who thinks deeply about the notion of acceleration and the fact that, for instance, you can, if you think about Latour's notion of the denial that is now the essence of what we see in Palestine, in Israel, not in Palestine, in Israel, the denial of what's happening. It's a whole language, right? And it's a language that anchors spatial categories by denying the temporality of what's happening. And we can go on about it. Latour says this is, in fact, the politics of our time. If you look at Trump, you look at all these authoritarian figures Agatha was mentioning, Putin and others, and you look at forms of complicity. Forms of complicity as the politics of our time are built on temporality rather than on space. Space is the propaganda that is used to anchor that down. And we can go on about it later, but that would be my immediate response.
Okay, just quickly, thank you so much for this remark. I agree with it, although I would defend Derrida, who indeed says that he's criticizing Levinas for this rigid dualism, which actually makes impossible the idea of a moral action. And he wants to get out of it, not by simply Hegelian dialectics. He rejects it. He thinks it is not efficient in this case. And I think Rich is for something that I call Marano dialectics, a kind of a praise of betrayal. Betrayal, perjury, he uses these concepts that he develops in his apology of the Marana condition, of the one who seemingly betrayed the traditional Judaism, yet in order to, thanks to this betrayal, actually disperse and disseminate this ethical mission, the law of Zion among the nations, by being properly in, not exile, not out, but being properly in. So this idea of betrayal as a necessary betrayal is a kind of a Derridian substitute for the Hegelian dialectics between the transcendent and the immanent, between the absolute ideal and the kind of a soiled world. And this is a controlled betrayal. Something like, Samuel Beckett famously said, fail again, fail better. In Derrida's case, it is betray, betray again, betray better. When this idea of a better betrayal is actually something that I think quite efficiently begins to mediate between the Levinasian two extreme, radical, irreconcilable poles. I can obviously talk more about it. We can talk about it later. It's a complex issue.
Thank you very much. I think we're concluding the panel on what I would call the temporality of the beautiful soul. I think it's the beginning of a wonderful few days of conversation. Please help me thank our speakers. We're meeting here at 7 o'clock. We're meeting at 7 o'clock for the keynote. So we have half an hour to have a drink and say hello and stretch ourselves. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Mediation.
I had no time at all to talk about Derrida, but
Yeah.
it was my fault.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to give a shout out to Agata, because this conference actually, it's almost a year in the making. It originally took form in a conversation that Elad and Gilad and I had at the conference that Agata organized last year in Nottingham. So it's almost a year to the week, I think, right? So I'm going to introduce both speakers. I'm going to introduce each one separately, and then we'll go. Amnon Raz-Krakotzkin, also known as, not also known as, who's known as No-No, is a professor of history in the Department of Jewish History at Gurion University. He was a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin and a scholar at the Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Among his publications are The Censor, the Editor, and the Text, Catholic Censorship in the Hebrew Literature in the 16th Century, Exile and Binationalism from Gershom Scholem and Hannah Arendt to Edward Said and Mahmoud Darwish. His recent book in Hebrew, which will soon appear in English, is entitled Mishneh Consciousness, Biblical Consciousness, Safed and the Zionist Critique, with Van Leer and Kibbutz Miyuchad from 2022. He's completing now a manuscript entitled Jewish History as a Counter-History, and in addition and relevant to this conference, No-No's seminal essay, Exile Within Sovereignty, Galut B'toch Ribonut, which was published first in Hebrew and then in English in 2017, became a touchstone for many of us who work on the question of exile, diaspora, and Zionism. His presentation this evening is entitled The Question of Israel and the Urgency of Binational Thinking. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I had several discussions with Gilad and Elad about the title, and they created, in fact, the lecture itself, The Question of Israel. Recent works of many of the participants in this workshop elaborate on exile and diaspora, the two very different translations of Galut, in order to propose a Jewish self-definition that will replace Zionism and the logic of the allegedly nation-state Israel. I'm inspired by many of these observations, share their critical and moral considerations, but I'm speaking from a different point of view, and my concerns are different. My concern is not the future of Judaism or the Jewish people, but the future of Israel. I refer to a different perception of Jewish people also. The Jewish in the American and European discourse is predominantly Ashkenazi, and as such follows the boundaries also of the Zionist Israel and the diaspora. My concern is the Israeli Jewish nation, the Hebrew-speaking nation, that has emerged through Zionist process of colonization and nationalization. This Jewish nation consists of a majority of Mizrahi Jews, as is in fact a Mizrahi entity. Only about a third of those considered as Ashkenazim live in Israel, a majority of which hold two passports, while most of the Sephardi Mizrahi Jews live in Israel. The diaspora of this nation is not world Jewry, or as it is called the Jewish diaspora, but consists of Israelis who live abroad and maintain the duality characteristic of diasporic communities of living simultaneity at two places. My focus is on Israel and the Israeli Jewish people. It is identical for me with Judaism, and I can't even escape into the distinction between Judaism and Zionism. I can, but it's meaningless. I belong to the Israeli Jewish nation, and at that moment I must take responsibility to this nation and its deed. Otherwise, my thought will be meaningless. Particularly, this is a part of the experience of the last months when you try to find a language in a situation, in a society in which nothing can be said and which is united by the denial of Palestine. My point is the necessity of exile, the title of Shaul's recent book, for Israel itself. In this context, exile is not the opposite of or alternative to sovereignty, and I'm coming back to my 93 essay, but a fundamental element in its formation or reformation. So I'm coming again about exile within sovereignty. I don't know who deserves the credit for this title. I think it's not my title, but Adi Ophir's title. In fact, the term exile gets actual meaning only in the land, because only there it can challenge and reject the logic of the nation state, the language that distinguishes between those who belong and not belong, and between colonizer who negate exile and the indigenous who are permanently exiled. It refers to the basic idea that we are exiled here, that is to say that we belong to the land. The land does not belong to us on this level. The insistence on exile is not a romantic image of the exilic Jew who does not have home, but a deep responsibility determined from the political power, among other things, the memory of suffering and the responsibility to those exiled from the land. In my recent book, mentioned here about Safad, I propose the exilic messianic of Safad as a starting point for that. For me, it is always accompanied by binational thinking, which means also that I can think Jewish exile, can't read Jewish text of exile without Mahmoud Darwish. I will end with it also, as part of the essence of binational thinking, that you can't speak about Israel, and I want to speak about Israel, without Palestine. Similarly, I can't be satisfied with the no state option. Where's Danny? Thank you. And in fact, it was Daniel Boyarin's recent book that clarified for me the need to think of the state and to take responsibility to the state. I couldn't think about it without Danny's challenge. There is a state, and we can't ignore it, in the name of future arrangement or to escape from our responsibility to the state and its deeds. Moreover, those who assume or dream that this state will disappear and that Israel will slowly decline do not take into consideration the fact that it is not simply a nation state, as it intends to present itself. It is a regional power, a nuclear weapon state whose nuclear strategy is called the Samson option. It will come to its end only within a catastrophe. Yes, there are many things, because the analogy to the Crusaders, when we think about Israel today, is almost obvious with this main difference. I mean, one can think about the Crusaders, indeed, 3 generations, a state of a colonizer state that emerged and simply disappeared. But it's not only that we don't see for the moment Salah ad-Din. I don't think that it's the same issue in this case. Similarly, I can be satisfied. No, this is I said. Israel is in a state of deep crisis, of course, in a very dangerous situation, and leads, besides the total destructions that it brings on Gaza, to its own destruction. Yet it will not disappear, but through a total catastrophe. And we have to prepare ourselves for that. One should hope to stop Israel, but in order to think of new direction, one have also to think how to reformulate Israel. Israel is in a state of a deep crisis, which forces us to ask, what is Israel? And enable us to think, what are its possible future? It is not clear what is Israel now. Israel is the question that should be solved. The problem, we talk about the Palestinian question, we should talk about the question of Israel. This is the question. This is the exception. Israel, Zion, that try to pretend to be a nation state. Destruction is embedded in the Zionistness. Masada will never fall again was said before there was nothing that could fall. It's there. It's embedded. It's not something that it comes from within this myth of destruction. The question is how to save Israel, and what is Israel that should be saved, or better, can be saved. How to stop Israel in the destructive brutality, and at the same time, how to preserve it. How to recognize Israel's sovereignty, and at the same time, to limit it by recognizing Palestine and the rights of Palestinians. What is the Israel that have the right to exist and to flourish, as I found in this strange text called the Jerusalem Declaration? In order to decolonize reality, it is crucial to recognize it. This is in a moment in which Israel's sovereignty is under question from different perspectives. It's not clear. Its very perception of security has been damaged. It does not control parts of its territory and have inner refugees, Jewish refugees, and no vision for the future but the religious national vision of ethnic cleansing. Israel's sovereignty is under question. We notice its brutal destruction, but we also have to remember that this brutality is the manifestation of weakness, a dangerous weakness, a tragic attempt to bring back its deterrence power that has been lost, and with that the illusion that externally it does not have the deterrent. It uncovered its fragility, it's lost its sovereignty in part, and lost its sovereignty in parts of Israel. We can't accept, of course, Israel as such, but in order to transform Israel, we have to recognize it as a way to clarify that Israel cannot exist without the recognition of Palestine. Israel is dominated now by a religious Zionist ideology that views the present as the realization of divine promises and believes that the current war provides the opportunity to evacuate the land. And there is no other alternative. It's not the extremist government. It is the entire Israeli consensus. And in fact, we should see this extremist policy as the logical conclusion of the basic aspects of Zionist ideology and Israeli self-perception. The demand for Jewish superiority is not limited to the right wing, and the anti-Bibi camp participated in the continuous attempt to eliminate the Palestinian question. It does not have any other vision for Israel. It will be wrong to call them extremists. Okay, I said it already. And we have to remember that Bezalel Smotrich is right, comparing himself to Ben-Gurion. Like him, he views himself as the follower of Joshua Ben Nun and believes in the transfer of the Palestinians. On these grounds and in this framework, I think we need to advance what I try to call binational thinking. I insist on binationalism as the only vision for Israel, and I will explain myself in a minute. Current Israel is based on the denial of binationalism. This is Israel, the denial of binationalism, the denial of Palestinian nationalism. But its only option rests in this idea. Binational is crucial and precondition to the recognition of Israel, one that stands against Jewish superiority, but one that demands a serious discussion on Israeli anxieties. Here is where we live, how to think about Israel when we are against Jewish superiority, which is the first principle on which Israel is established, the Jewish superiority, the denial, explicit or implicit, of Palestinians. These discussions will become possible only when Israel will realize its defeat and consequently its limitations. Many aspects of its sovereignty have been collapsed in a way that demands its reevaluation. The term binationalism raises many objections, mainly because of the term nationalism, which is indeed problematic, misleading perhaps, and definitely inaccurate and not satisfactory. I accept many of the objections against this term. I try for years to speak about binationalism unsuccessfully, what makes me think sometimes that it's the wrong term, but I don't have any other term. Yes? Any other term for as a starting point. How to speak about Israel and Palestine without speaking about binationalism. Yeah. I insist on it, though not as a political vision, but as some principles that should be advanced, and that otherwise all the discussion about decolonization remains, in my opinion, meaningless. It is for me a starting point and not the end, yet it is the only alternative for Israel. In October 6th, I sent to some friends, mainly Palestinians, a draft of a text I entitled The Urgency of Binational Thinking. I didn't know yet that it was October 6th. It was sent mainly to Palestinians because it generated in a conversation in August last year, organized by Hanin Zorbi in Nazareth, in which I presented my ideas about binationalism. I sent it in October 6th. I thought it is urgent in order to prevent the coming catastrophe that was in the air. Like always, you can think that catastrophe is coming, but when it comes, by definition, it is a surprise. That's like redemption. Many of them told me that whether they agree or disagree, this text is directed for Jews and not for Palestinians, because it will propose an alternative for Jews. As Ardakowar said, it proposed an alternative perception of security from the Israeli Jews. Himad Zobi argued that the text is haunted by my existential anxieties. She and Muhammad Jabali also published some months earlier an essay in which they presented binationalism as a Zionist agenda. I tend to agree with them. But that does not prevent me from insisting on the concept and the potential it carries, but clarifies the difference of perspectives, and that indeed I have to rewrite it for the Israeli Jews. I speak with Palestinians, and it's not that. But my duty here, my position here, are different. It's not an attempt to establish a common text immediately, but to work to take responsibility and to think about my brother Jews, Israelis. I think that political thinking that emerged from existential anxiety have many more advantages than political thinking that based on the suffering and actually preserves the balance of power. That is, of course, in condition that we have Gaza in our mind. Catastrophe has already happened, and even if you expect a catastrophe, by definition it comes as a surprise. In the first weeks after, it seems simply impossible, the first weeks after October 7th, yes, because again, for me it happened that I sent it in October 6th. I know that some of them will be angry that I'm writing in Chol HaMoed, but that's the truth. Yet it remains urgent in order to produce any opposition that takes into consideration both people. I will try to explain. I'll try to explain what I mean and what I don't mean. First of all, I must emphasize that by using the term binationalism, I do not refer to a one-state solution from the river to the sea as the preferred solution. I don't think that this is a realistic option, and I think that the question of Israel can be solved only within a wider regional context. And I think that binationalism leads us also to think about the situation in the region, in Syria and Lebanon. This is not the question now, and I do not believe in solutions and abstract models that's supposed to be imposed on reality. It is urgent because there is no solution, and in order to try to direct reality from this point of view. I also think that the question of Israel can be solved only within a wider regional context, but it can be done only in the condition of the recognition of Palestine. One can say that not only that binationalism is not a solution, but it marks the questions, the problems, the contradictions with which we have to deal, with the contradiction that we have to address. And for me, indeed, binational thinking means to carry all these contradictions, to work with Jews, basically non-liberal Jews. I don't find common language with liberal Jews and with Palestinians. On the one hand, it proposed simple and clear principles to which we have to direct ourselves, civil and national equality. But on the other hand, it raises questions and contradictions that current critical discourse tend to ignore. Therefore, I suggest to regard it as a bridge, as a mediator between the present reality of Jewish superiority and its consequences and vision of shared lives that have to accompany the way to first stop the current process of dispossession. It is also not about sovereignty. The discussion about solutions and peace is always about sovereignty. The problem is that we are waiting for different kind of sovereignty and have no tools to deal with the continuous disposition of the future. I direct myself toward the sovereign at the moment, and the sovereign is Israel. I have to address the sovereign. And I will repeat it again later, I'm thinking in the same way that was presented by Adi Ophir and Ariela Azulay in the book, The One State Condition, that was published, I think, 15 years ago. On the other hand, this Zionism needs to realize something that I see it as a starting point directed at the sovereign and the sovereign now in Israel that under the discussion about the future keep the process of disposition and denial of Palestinians, mainly in the West Bank and under support of the West. Binationalism serves as a mediator, as a bridge between the present and possible future. Binationalism is first of all a description of reality, a colonial and obviously asymmetrical, but at the same time directs towards decolonization of that reality. Zionism created two nations that exist for the moment under the Israeli regime in the one-state condition, under the Israeli regime, and established the regime on national levels. It is impossible to discuss Israel and to think about its future without dealing with this issue. Therefore, decolonization of Zionism is an opportunity to raise a critical approach. And I prefer the term decolonization of Zionism as proposed by Walter Minolo to the de-Zionization of Israel proposed by Mahmoud Mamdani in his very important book. Israel-Palestine is not simply a case study of colonialism or ethnic conflicts. It's Zion. It's the core of the thinking, or we can think about Western discussion on sovereignty without Zion as the exception. The two terms carry with them exilic consciousness. Exilic consciousness is crucial for such an attempt, and in fact it is impossible to think about Jewish exile without speaking Palestine. Palestine is the manifestation of exile. And to follow Mahmoud Darwish, she is the queen in exile. She is Sayyidat al-Ard. She is the manifestation of Sfirat Malchut, kingdom of the Shekhinah, from a Jewish point of view. When I read Mahmoud Darwish thinking about Palestine, when I think about exile, I can think about any exilic Jewish term, whether it is Rabbi Moshe Cordovero or Walter Benjamin, without Mahmoud Darwish as a mediator. It's not only Mahmoud Darwish, of course, I concentrate on Mahmoud Darwish because he is a great thinker without whom I can think, but it's part of the entire Palestinian experience and culture. There is no Palestine without exile. There is no Palestine. One can think about the earlier origins of Palestinian identity, but this is not important, I think. There is no Palestine without exile. There is no Palestine. Palestine is a product of Zionism. The Sephardian rabbis of the 16th century believed that the role is to raise the Shekhinah and bring her back to her place in heaven. Accordingly, we should turn the efforts to advance a Jewish practice that bring back Palestine as a crucial part of understanding of Zion. That may be decolonization of Zionism as a process in which exilic consciousness insists on its role in the formation of sovereignty as a concept. That may reflect on the entire bleeding region. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nono. We're going to have a second presentation, and then we'll have a general discussion. Lena Salaymeh was a British Academy Global Professor in the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, and now is a professor at the École Pratique in Paris. She's a scholar of law and history with specializations in Islamic jurisprudence and critical theory. She received the Guggenheim Fellowship, and her first book, The Beginnings of Islamic Law, Late Antique Islamicate Legal Traditions, received the American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion in the category of Textual Studies. Lena was also an associate professor of law at Tel Aviv University and a visiting associate research scholar at Princeton's Davis Center for Historical Studies and a Robbins Fellow at UC Berkeley School of Law. She also received an Andrew Mellon Fellowship of Scholars in Critical Bibliography. She serves on the editorial board of Law and History Review. She earned a PhD in Legal and Middle Eastern History from UC Berkeley and her JD from Harvard Law School. She's a member of the California Bar, and the title of her talk is Decolonizing Jewish Politics, the Coloniality of Jewish-Muslim Coupling.
Okay. Thanks for the intro. And can everybody see the screen? At that end of the room, you can all see the screen. Okay, great. Thank you also for the invitation to be here and to the organizers. Speak a little louder or put the microphone closer?
Yeah, closer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So also thank you to the organizers for all the work in organizing this event. So the conference theme, Between State and Exile, suggests that there are only two options in Jewish politics, Jewish statehood or Jewish statelessness. And like many modern binaries, this binary of state or statelessness is misleading because it does not represent the plurality of Jewish political options, the multiple alternatives to both statehood and statelessness. In addition to being inaccurate and reductionist, this binary is dangerous because it is part of the underlying logic of Zionism. Zionist ideology uses this false binary to allege that statelessness is a form of uprootedness, whether it is called diaspora or exile. The notion of displacement is then used to justify the establishment of a settler colonial state. Viewing statelessness as exile or diaspora is itself a distortion, a misrepresentation of Jewish collectivity and Jewish history. This false binary does not represent the way things are in the world or the way they could be. Instead, it reflects how a particular ideology constructs a limiting window for viewing the past, present, and future. Zionist ideology promotes this misrepresentation for a simple reason. If the only options are state or statelessness, then most people in the modern world will choose statehood because they have been indoctrinated into thinking that the state is necessary for basic security. Thus, the binary is itself a hazardous hallucination, and we are witnessing the implications of this false binary in the genocide in Gaza. Zionists claim that they are massacring Palestinians, 50,000 at this point, to maintain their colonial state and to avoid statelessness. Since Zionist ideology fabricates this binary as a justification for its violent colonialism, it must be dismantled. Put differently, this binary logic must be demolished in order to deconstruct the intellectual foundations of Zionism. Zionist epistemology creates a false binary between state and statelessness, and that binary resonates in the coupling of Jews and Muslims. In the global north, Jews and Muslims are constantly juxtaposed, grouped together, and compared. The coupling of Jews and Muslims is not neutral. It is not a coincidence. It is not a representation of reality. As an empirical matter, coupling Jews and Muslims or the Jewish and Islamic traditions is neither obvious nor organic. Much of my scholarship has sought to problematize the coupling of Jews and Muslims in scholarship. Trying to measure differences or similarities between these traditions is methodologically unsound because comparison depends on scale, scope, and situation. Rather than concrete evidence, a simplistic and romanticized presumption of similarity often animates the coupling of Jews and Muslims. Judaism and Islam are mischaracterized as being similar religions. Likewise, Jews and Muslims are mischaracterized as being similar minorities. The conventional coupling does not account for change, context, or contingency. Indeed, the coupling of Jews and Muslims reflects fairy tales of both conflict and coexistence. Colonial thinking portrays Jews and Muslims as so-called inherently related, while also portraying them as inherently in conflict. And much of this Gila Najjar, who's in the room, has written about. Not coincidentally, recent normalization agreements sought to bring together Jews and Muslims under the banner of Abraham. These efforts occlude the fact that the colonization of Palestine is neither caused by the Jewish or Islamic traditions. Jews and Muslims are coupled so as to place them within this fairy tale of conflict and coexistence. Whereas the binary of state or statelessness functions to justify Zionist colonialism, the coupling of Jews and Muslims functions to distort Zionist colonialism. Coupling Jews and Muslims hides the colonization of Palestine. The coupling misrepresents Zionist colonialism as a so-called conflict between Jews and Muslims, rather than a colonial situation in which there are colonizers and colonized. In turn, the same colonial logic presents so-called coexistence as the solution to the so-called conflict rather than decolonization. The coupling of Jews and Muslims often reflects a colonial epistemology, just as the Zionist binary of state or statelessness must be dismantled. The Zionist coupling of Jews and Muslims must be uncoupled. The coupling of Jews and Muslims is a multi-layered phenomenon. It is discernible in topics that seem far removed from the colonization of Palestine, but the prevalence of the coupling, in the minutest of details, contributes to its hegemony. The remainder of my talk illustrates that coupling is the consequence of problematic ways of looking at the Jewish and Islamic traditions. Coupling also constructs false images of Jewish and Islamic traditions. So I propose that in the global north, the prevalent coupling of Muslims and Jews reflects a secular epistemology. In turn, the secular coupling is instrumentalized in the service of colonialism. As I move through layers of Jewish-Muslim coupling, I will highlight how each layer is formed. As you can see on the slide, you can imagine some kind of a geological sediment. I couldn't find the right picture, but this is the picture we've got. So as you can see on the slide, in each layer, the coupling of Jews and Muslims results from the same three problematic heuristics that I will explain: essentialism, selection bias, and perspectivism. Briefly, essentialism is the attribution of assets or characteristics as necessary or essential. Selection bias refers to the selection of data that is neither randomized or representative, meaning that the data is selected based on unacknowledged and subjective bias. And perspectivism refers to how an observer's perspective shapes observation. Essentialism, selection bias, and perspectivism are interrelated and overlap. That was interesting. Essentialism, so they're interrelated and they overlap. Essentialism may be understood as a form of selection bias, and selection bias can be understood as a consequence of perspectivism. Nonetheless, I'm going to analyze them separately in the talk. These three common ways of thinking, essentialism, selection bias, and perspectivism, misrepresent the Jewish and Islamic traditions as similar in public discourse, academic scholarship, secular governance, colonial governance, and colonial epistemology. And I'm going to try to go through all of those in, let's see, 30 minutes, if I don't go over time. So, before we look at the layers of coupling, I want to offer some basic definitions. Secularism is an ideology that began in early modern Europe. Secular ideology differentiates between the secular and religion, two categories that emerged in modern Europe. While there are many varieties of secularism, they all share a concern with separating politics and religion. Several common assumptions about secularism are not based on historical or empirical facts. Secularism is not inevitable, it is not neutral, it is not a phase in a process of human development. Although there are distinctions in the European, North American, and non-Western expressions of secularism, The many varieties of secularism share a concern with dividing the secular from religion. However, secularism is not an alternative to religion. Instead, secularism defines religion. Furthermore, the secular objective of distinguishing between the secular and religion does not necessarily result in freedom or liberation. A secular society can be oppressive, authoritarian, xenophobic, just as it can be progressive, democratic, or inclusive. Secularism is what exists in the world, not what people imagine is true secularism. In the global north, essentialism, selection bias, and perspectivism often are based on secular thinking. Secularism is also a form of Eurocentric bias. Eurocentrism is the use of modern European ideas and practices as standards that are applied universally. Eurocentrism is false because distinct societies have different beliefs and practices that meet their specific needs or that accommodate their circumstances. Overcoming Eurocentric bias is necessary for overcoming secular bias. Like gender or racial bias, secular bias can be both conscious and unconscious. And like gender or racial bias, secular bias is normalized. That is, secular bias is an embedded and common aspect of contemporary societies. So like secular bias is prevalent and dominant, such that most people do not see or recognize it. The image on the slide demonstrates a significant implication of secular perspectivism. As you can see in the image, French police are forcing a Muslim woman to remove her clothing in order to conform to their expectations of how one should be dressed at a beach in southern France. And that's secular perspectivism in a nutshell. So Europeans spread secular ideology to other parts of the world, primarily through colonialism and neo-colonialism. Colonizers espoused a civilizing mission that included secularism. In addition, colonial governance used the category of religion as a tool of colonial power. Depending on local circumstances, colonizers used religion to regulate the lives of colonized peoples or to divide and conquer them. So for example, British colonizers developed the category of Hinduism as a strategy for facilitating domination of the extremely diverse colonized subjects of India. In contrast, British and French colonial governance in Muslim-majority areas often controlled colonized subjects by dividing them into confessional and sectarian groups, requiring them to abide by specific religious laws and preventing them from unifying. When European colonizers conquered and occupied colonized regions of the world, they sometimes justified their violence by claiming that they were spreading secularism and liberating people from religion. So secular ideology is a component of epistemic colonialism. Colonialism is the socio-political domination of a territory and society. Epistemic colonialism is intellectual domination. It is a mode of thought that legitimizes colonialism while espousing universalism. Epistemic colonialism couples the Jewish and Islamic traditions, as well as Jews and Muslims, through the secular notion of religion. So I gave you a lot of definitions. For some of you, it was new. For some of you, it was something you've heard me say like 10,000 times, and I apologize to those of you who've heard it many times. But the definitions are necessary for those of you for whom it's new. And now with those definitions, we're going to start looking at those layers. So again, imagine that image of layering and the coupling. Essentialism involves the reduction of a tradition to a set of qualities or characteristics, and a common essentialism of the Jewish and Islamic traditions in public discourse in the global north reduces them to scriptural text. On the slide, I listed some of the scriptural and other significant texts in each tradition. The Jewish and Islamic traditions are misperceived as having similar scriptures. This is inaccurate not only because the Hebrew Bible and the Quran are dissimilar in significant ways, but more importantly, because the role of each text within the respective tradition is distinct. Moreover, traditions cannot be reduced to a set of texts. The Jewish tradition and the Islamic tradition are much broader and more complex than scriptural texts. Selection bias in public discourse misrepresents both traditions by selectively focusing on aspects that seem similar. These aspects include practices such as dietary restrictions, circumcision, and modest dress. This approach is inaccurate because for every similarity one may identify, there are numerous differences being ignored. Here again, measuring differences is not my point. Instead, I want to emphasize that it is the observer who selects the connections between the two traditions based on idiosyncratic presumptions rather than empirical or comprehensive knowledge. And the image on the slide, on the right side, illustrates selection bias. Another reason why the Jewish and Islamic traditions are coupled is because of the perspective of the observer. Someone who is looking at the Jewish and Islamic traditions from within the Western Christian tradition will perceive these traditions differently from someone who is looking at them from the perspective of a different tradition or a different geographic location. So Jews and Muslims are coupled frequently in Western public discourse because of their so-called similar practices. Circumcision is an example of a practice that often leads to coupling the Jewish and Islamic traditions in the global north. However, someone in Africa, where circumcision is widely practiced and quite normative, may not view circumcision as a similarity between the Jewish and Islamic traditions, but rather as a practice normative to many peoples. In the global north, the perspective of the observer, particularly the observer's sense of difference, frequently results in the coupling of the Jewish and Islamic traditions. And the image on the right side of the slide depicts perspectivism. All of that clear? Too fast? No? Usually people tell me I'm too fast. No? It's good? Okay, good. So let's shift to our next layer, which is scholarship. Scholars apply essentialism in their couplings of Judaism and Islam through the notion of Semites. The discipline of comparative philology searched for the original Indo-European or Aryan or Semitic language, using the concept of original language and Ursprache. 19th century scholars used the Proto-Semitic family tree to essentialize the Jewish and Islamic traditions as Semitic. Many contemporary scholars continue to think through this model and thereby view the Jewish and Islamic traditions as if they correspond to Hebrew and Arabic in the Semitic family tree. Consequently, they presume that these two traditions share an essentially similar grammar. Scholars often perceive the Jewish tradition as the older Semitic forefather of the Islamic tradition, and they thus presume that ideas and practices in the Jewish tradition have the same meanings or result from the same sources as ideas and practices in the Islamic tradition. This is totally inaccurate. This sort of essentializing is inaccurate because it does not take into account the hybridity and flexibility of traditions. Traditions change and contain within them considerable diversity, such that this linear, vertical, and essentializing model is incorrect. To the person taking photos of my slides, it's totally fine if you do it for your personal interest, but please don't post it on Twitter, which is where I keep finding the slides from my talks. Okay, scholars also apply selection bias in their couplings of Judaism and Islam through the notion of religion. The discipline of religious studies was established in Europe as a separate department of study in the 19th century. In many European states, religious studies constituted a challenge to the authority of the church, with religious studies scholars viewing themselves explicitly as anti-clerical. Consequently, religious studies did not begin as a neutral or objective field of scholarship, but rather as a form of anti-clerical Christian theology. The theological underpinnings of religious studies linger today. When scholars examine the Jewish and Islamic traditions through the perspective of religious studies, they selectively choose specific aspects of the traditions that are theological or that conform to their pre-existing assumptions about religion. Protestant Christian definitions of religion shape what aspect of traditions, or what aspects, of traditions scholars study and how they study them. Traditions contain within them dimensions that do not correspond to the notion of religion. Selection bias in the study of Jewish and Islamic traditions leads to their coupling. Scholarly couplings of Judaism and Islam in the global north often rest on Eurocentric perspectivism. Scholars often perceive similarities between the Jewish and Islamic traditions as compared to Western Christian traditions. That is, scholars other the Jewish and Islamic traditions in parallel ways. Importantly, Jewish perspectives on the Islamic tradition and Muslim perspectives on the Jewish tradition do not inform those Eurocentric perspectives. So if someone were to investigate how the Jewish tradition views the Islamic tradition, for example, she would find multiple and different views in Ashkenazi and Sephardi traditions. In the multivocal Jewish tradition, generally, Muslims are referred to as Ishmaelites and perceived as heretical monotheists. By comparison, the multivocal Islamic tradition generally views Jews as one of many known and unknown groups under the category of people of the book. Jews are recognized as having received a previous divine law, and they constituted a significant percentage of the early Muslim community. So this is admittedly a rather idiosyncratic sketch, and much more details could be added to it. But my point here is that the two traditions understand each other distinctly from how they are depicted in conventional scholarship in the global north. Scholarly coupling of Judaism and Islam is the consequence of a particular perspective of looking at these traditions from a specific time and place, the modern global north. So let's now shift to our next layer, secular governance. Secular institutions in the global north enact the three heuristics I have delineated in multiple ways. So we'll focus on the doctrine of religious freedom. I've written about all of these things, by the way, so that's why I'm picking these particular cases. But so we're going to focus on that. Rather than removing religion from the public sphere, secular law regulates religion in ways that are incongruent with Jewish and Islamic traditions. Secular institutions essentialize traditions by defining them as religiosity, meaning private belief, individual right, and autonomous choice. These three dimensions of religiosity conflict with Jewish and Islamic traditions because, contrary to secularism, Jewish and Islamic traditions entail public acts, collective obligations, and a different understanding of autonomy. So secular governance essentializes the Jewish and Islamic traditions in parallel ways, resulting in their coupling. Secular institutions enact selection bias through the notion of religious law. In contemporary law and religion controversies, secular states restrict or even criminalize non-Christian practices under the principle of secularism. Secular legal principles are used to determine which practices should be classified as religious or cultural, obligatory or optional, or ethical or unethical. And that process of classification is not impartial, but rather biased against non-Christian traditions, including Judaism and Islam. So, for example, secular courts have prohibited Islamic symbols, but permitted Christian symbols, such as the cross, because the cross is characterized as cultural and not religious. Secular ideology selectively chooses which aspects of the Jewish and Islamic legal traditions to designate as falling under religious freedom, and typically, religious freedom is accorded to aspects of a tradition that conform with Eurocentric notions of religiosity or religious law. So secular governance imposes selection bias of the Jewish and Islamic traditions in parallel ways, resulting in their coupling. Secular institutions impose secular perspectivism, which, as we discussed, is Eurocentric. So secularism oppresses particular groups disproportionately. The basic secular principle of removing religion from the public sphere inequitably disadvantages Jews and Muslims and exposes them to Judeophobia and Islamophobia. Secularism normalizes Judeophobia and Islamophobia by delineating a category of religion that is, in fact, incongruent with Judaism and Islam, thereby systematically subjugating non-Christian minorities. Notably, secularism normalizes Judeophobia and Islamophobia even in majority Jewish or majority Muslim societies. And there are many examples of Judeophobia in contemporary Israel, as an example. Most importantly, Judeophobia and Islamophobia, as two interrelated forms of secular bias, underlie the prevalent coupling of Judaism and Islam, or Jews and Muslims, in the global north. Secular prejudice views the Jewish and Islamic traditions as similar. So we've now looked at how secular essentialism, secular selection bias, and secular perspectivism shape public discourse, scholarship, and secular governance. Those are the three layers that we've looked at. Now we're going to look at colonial governance and epistemic colonialism, but I want you to think about those layers of being solidified under colonial governance. Colonial governance uses secularism to manage and discipline the colonized as well as to justify colonialism. Zionists justified the colonization of Palestine as necessary because of its essential religious significance. So I'm offering two quotes, and I'm sorry that the font is a bit small. First, Palestine can never be regarded as a country on the same footing as the other Arab countries. You cannot ignore all history and tradition in the matter. You cannot ignore the fact that this is the cradle of two of the great religions of the world. It is a sacred land to the Arabs, but is also a sacred land to the Jew and the Christian. And the future of Palestine cannot possibly be left to be determined by the temporary impressions and feelings of the Arab majority in the country of the present day. That was the Peel Commission report from July 1937. Second quote, Palestine is a holy land, sacred to Christian, to Jew, and to Muslim alike. And because it is a holy land, Palestine is not and can never become a land which any race or religion can justly claim as its very own. We further, in the same emphatic way, affirm that the fact that it is the Holy Land sets Palestine completely apart from other lands and dedicates it to the precepts and practices of the brotherhood of man, not those of narrow nationalism. That's the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, report to the United States government, 1946. Western colonizers misrepresent Zionist colonizers as essentially Jews and misrepresent the colonized as essentially Muslim. In addition to being inaccurate, this essentialism is the basis of the colonial coupling of Jews and Muslims. So as previously noted, Jews and Muslims are often depicted as in a so-called conflict, rather than a colonial situation in which there are colonizers and colonized. This is why recent normalization agreements brought together Jews and Muslims to coexist under the deceptive banner of Abraham. In the interest of time, I can't delve into the details, but it's important to understand that the figure of Abraham has dissimilar roles in the Jewish and Islamic traditions. They don't mean the same thing. I mean, Abraham in these two traditions does not mean the same thing. Colonial governance selectively constructs Abraham as a figure of conflict and coexistence, thereby justifying and reinforcing colonial governance. The colonization of Palestine is not the consequence of either the Jewish or Islamic traditions, and similarly, the colonization of Palestine is not caused by Jews and Muslims, but rather by colonizers. Many groups in the global north who seek to challenge Zionism rely on the anti-colonial move of emphasizing coexistence to counter the colonial myth of conflict. However, as is clear from the Abrahamic model, both conflict and coexistence are part of the same colonial epistemology. This is because both conflict and coexistence rely on religious and ethnic classifications of the colonizer and the colonized, and thereby distort colonialism. While the Abraham Accords were an overt normalization effort, there are other initiatives that use the language of coupling to achieve similar objectives. So for example, the so-called two-state myth and, binationalism, are often varieties of the Abrahamic model because they perpetuate the colonial coupling of Jews and Muslims through colonial perspectivism, and they completely ignore that it is the indigenous population that must determine the decolonization process. The final layer that we will examine is epistemic colonialism. Essentialism, selection bias, and perspectivism are all evident in how Zionist epistemology narrates Jewish history. The conventional Zionist story narrates Jewish history as effectively beginning with the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, or with the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era, and ending with the establishment of a state for Zionist Jews. It is a story of linear progress, culminating in a modern nation state as a so-called happy ending to what was previously, to use the terminology of Salo Baron, a lachrymose story in which Jews were forced to leave Palestine. The conventional anti-Zionist story narrates Jewish history as beginning with the Babylonian dispersion or the destruction of the temple by the Romans, and culminating in a modern global diaspora that is thriving outside a Zionist state. This is also a linear progress story, but it emphasizes that Jews largely chose to live outside Palestine. These stories are simplifications, that there are multiple variations related to each of these stories, and these stories obviously draw from pre-modern Jewish thought. Nonetheless, both these stories reflect Zionist colonial epistemology by essentializing the varieties of Jewish experience within the binary with which we began, statehood versus statelessness. Selection bias and perspectivism are evident in how Zionist epistemology defines Jewish collectivity. The tribe of Judah was the first Israelite tribe to live in Palestine, but the tribe of Judah is not the origin of all Jews. The category of Jewish people may not begin with Judah, and it is unlikely that most Jews are descendants of the tribe of Judah. As numerous scholars have demonstrated, Jews have multiple ancestors. Palestine was a geographic location in which Israelites, Judeans, and later Jews lived, and where many rabbinic figures composed and canonized various Jewish texts. And obviously, other groups lived there as well. But the story of the Jewish people could begin outside Palestine, with Abraham in Babylonia, or Moses in Egypt, or the Israelites in Assyria, or with other Jewish communities in other parts of Southwest Asia or Africa. Jews do not share one common geographic place, but multiple beginnings in multiple places. Moreover, the notion that Jews were exiled from or left Palestine is ahistorical. The destruction of the first temple and exile that followed it affected some people from Judah, but more importantly, it became a paradigm for an imaginary repetition symbolized in the commemoration of the same holiday, Tisha B'Av. Nonetheless, there was continued historical presence of some Jews in Palestine for approximately 2,000 years prior to Zionism. There were Jewish migrations to Palestine that preceded the modern era that were spearheaded by the Karaites. And the historical evidence indicates migration from Palestine by choice in many cases. Simply put, the oversimplified notion of Jewish exile is ahistorical. Zionist constructions of Jewish history and collectivity are informed by secular perspectivism. Santiago Slobodowski observed that the contemporary notion of Jewish peoplehood, quote, and this is on the slide, reproduces the racist coloniality inherent in some European nationalism by creating an inexistent blood link between the mythical and current Jewish populations, ipso facto claiming not only an ahistorical cohesion, but also ownership of a territory their ancestors never inhabited. Arab Jews and Palestinians became the victims of the first and second mandate, end quote. Slobodowski's observation about the blood link is crucial, and while there is much evidence for the significance of kinship among Jews, kinship is not equivalent to ethnicity or religion, both of which are colonial categories. Moreover, kinship is not the exclusive basis for Jewish identity. So where does the notion of return from exile come from? Israel Yuval argues that in the 4th and 5th centuries, Jews began narrating the destruction of the Second Temple as an exile in response to Christian polemics. Although the exile after the destruction of the Second Temple was mythical, not historical, it became normalized. Yuval explains, in the quotes on the slide, quote, just as Christians claimed that Jews had crucified Jesus and thereby deserved the punishment of exile, so Jews claimed that Christians, whom Jews identified with mythical Edom, had exiled the chosen people from the Promised Land and thereby deserved their future punishment, the messianic revenge that would precede the Jews' final redemption. Fixing the destruction of the temple as the beginning of the exile thus created a reverse symmetry between Jewish and Christian time, making the historical reality of the period between crucifixion, destruction, and Parousia, redemption, merely temporary, end quote. Similarly, Santiago Slobodowski warned against a, quote, Christian or European reification of Jewish peoplehood. It naturalizes the Christian myth of Jewish exile as a form of punishment. While this was originally used by Christians to convert Jews, it subsequently became trapped by its own narrative, negating the value of the diaspora outside persecution, end quote. The notion of Jews as a group exiled from Palestine is a myth developed by Orthodox rabbis for theological polemics against Christians. It was subsequently appropriated by Zionists for colonial purposes. The previous slides deconstructed Zionist epistemology's narratives of Jewish history and definition of Jewish collectivity. This deconstruction results in understanding that the Jewish tradition is not a religion. Jews are not an ethnicity or religious group. The Zionist entity is a settler colonial state for colonial Jews, not a so-called Jewish state. Muslims were absent from these slides because Zionist epistemology constructs the encounter between Jews and Muslims as not really beginning until the colonial encounter. More than a millennium of Jewish-Muslim interactions is simply ignored because the coupling of Jews and Muslims is not historical, but rather part of a colonial imaginary. And I imagine that Ariella will be discussing this in detail. Epistemic colonialism distorts the Jewish and Islamic traditions, as well as relations between Jews and Muslims. The coupling of Jews and Muslims that is prevalent in the global North results from viewing them through secular essentialism, selection bias, and perspectivism. And these secular heuristics lay the groundwork for both colonial governance and colonial epistemology. Contrary to the framing of coupling, colonialism is not a conflict, and colonialism cannot be terminated through coexistence. Epistemic decolonization cannot be achieved through the coupling of Jews and Muslims as either religions or ethnicities that can coexist. The colonizer and the colonized cannot be coupled. Decolonizing Jewish politics necessitates recognizing pluriversal ways of being Jewish that are not limited to religion or ethnicity or to statehood and statelessness. Decolonizing Jewish politics necessitates rejecting colonial essentialism, selection bias, and perspectivism in order to decouple Jews and Muslims. The coupling of Jews and Muslims is one of many colonial tools of disorientation, hiding Zionist colonialism in plain sight. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you. It's a lot there. So we have time for questions, discussions. I'll start with Natalia and we'll just go around. Natalia? Yeah. Yeah, there are people.
Thank you. I feel so stimulated by those two presentations and the tensions. I have a question for Lena with respect to kind of your mention of the no-no's binationalism, because my understanding is that it's not about kind of a prescription binational prescription, but rather binational ethics that necessitates dialectics that centers actually recognition of all those kind of layers of erasures and denials of kind of the colonial epistemology and the actual settler colonial reality. So I guess one question that I wrestle with, and I'm very immersed in the kind of the decolonial literature, is how to think through those questions in ways that are not eliminative. Eliminative. And then, in a sense, another dimension of this question for Nono is how do you think through questions about, what does it mean to decolonize? And that connects to Lena, is land back and kind of the materiality of the decolonial move, land back, the question of Palestinian return, kind of the central questions of justice. So I don't know, maybe those questions can help the conversation to navigate those two positions. Thanks.
Thank you. You want to respond?
No, that's good.
Okay.
I would have to respond, therefore, on
my response?
On Natalia's comments about your comments against me.
Okay, so I understand Nono as having very good intentions. So, and we're friends. There's no problem here. But yes, but the idea of binationalism is based on the notion of nation, and nation is a part of a colonial epistemology. So, as you know, from a decolonial perspective, decolonialists are interested not simply in redefining terms or taking dominant terms and giving them new meaning, but actually changing the terms of the conversation. So changing the way we talk about things. For me, the problem with the binationalism discourse is that it presumes that the indigenous population wants binationalism. And that's not a presumption that anyone should be making without directly speaking to the indigenous population. And speaking to a group of scholars is irrelevant.
Yeah. But what about the sociological facts? So, that I think that Nona was talking about, that there are two nations. I mean, sociologically.
I think that it's part of the decolonial epistemology to say there are groups of people. They're not only two. It's problematic to think of them as two. And there's a power differential between colonizer and colonized. And I think that in many cases, people are saying binationalism because they don't want to say decolonization, and they're trying to avoid conversations about right of return and redistribution of wealth and redistribution of land.
No, you want to?
Just few words for the beginning, yes, because as I said, I think I will not defend the term binationalism, but I don't know how to work without it. I mean, I'm well aware of the fact that nationalism was emerging this thing, and I think that even if it's a colonial structure, it exists. And in order to think about what we now call decolonization, a title that I wanted to give 20 years ago and was refused, by the way, which is interesting, and to give it meaning, because decolonization, yes, because we have to start from the reality as it is. I don't think that the Jews are a nation. I don't think that the Palestinians are a nation. I think that these are two nations that indeed emerge under the British mandate that separated Palestine, even before, as you showed, from other parts of the Middle East. Part of thinking politically is how to work against these divisions of the entire Middle East today, because they are questions. And we have to remember that the changes that take place, and that's something that we can know now, is not because of to continue the intellectual discussion until we reach some brilliant ideas that will give us a framework of decolonization, but how we react to reality and things that happen there, and thinking through this reality, how can we use some advantages in order to shift the discourse? Now, I don't know what is binationalism. I don't have an idea of binational state. I think it's horrible. I think it's even worse because it will keep me only with Jews. I will not do what to do with myself anyway. But I don't, so it's part of, and this is the problem you mentioned, I agree. There is a problem inherent in the term, which I don't know how to overcome, and I don't know how to if you will give me another term that think about the possibility. Decolonization. Decolonization is empty. Decolonization is empty. It's simply empty. It has nothing to say. You say decolonization and you continue working. What are you doing in this? That's what I think. I mean, for decolonization, you have to be more concrete, to think about anxieties of both people. It's not a question, you said, no one wants binationalism. No one wants anything. What people want? People want to, indeed, to get some freedom. Some of you, I don't know, one of you in this conversation.
No, I mean, you shouldn't assume that the indigenous people want
what? The indigenous people don't want binationalism. They don't have time to want. The indigenous people, wants to survive. I mean, they have to fight. That's exactly the comment I mentioned by him at Zorbi. We are not discussing now, again, a meeting to discuss a kind of Palestinian-Israeli compromise or what. No, we are thinking about how to advance from this situation, and I can't force Palestinians to ask me now to accept my equal rights. No.
Let me just be clear.
How you connect to the land back dimension?
If
you just do an equality discourse, then what is decolonization? To get land back, to return. Right?
That's what I think. The point is, okay. Of course, what we talk about is limitation of Israel and thinking about arrangements that we can't talk about them now because they are part of an ongoing reality in which we try to find ways to struggle that we don't have. Don't forget that we are talking in the midst. Now we have the question is how to stop Israel in Gaza. Not more than that. I think that's what we should ask. But meanwhile, we think about it. I don't know how. I think, but that's why I mentioned it as a starting point for something in order to limit, to question, to judge the deeds of Israel without making it, without forgetting the fact that there are two distinctive peoples here.
Okay, so I just want to clarify that there's a difference between material decolonization and epistemic decolonization. And most of the people here in this room have nothing to do with material decolonization of Palestine. The decolonization of Palestine. There's a difference between material and epistemic decolonization.
So tell us a distinction. Tell us a distinction.
So they're connected, but most of the people in this room are not qualified to talk about material decolonization. You're not there on the ground actually involved in decolonization efforts, and you can't represent people who are involved in decolonization. As scholars, our specialization, our potential specialization would be epistemic decolonization. How do we actually deconstruct the epistemological tools of Zionist colonialism? That's where we are supposed to be making our sort of contribution. But thinking that we somehow are going to be the ones to decolonize Palestine is just a fantasy. People on the ground are the ones who are supposed to do it too. We shouldn't be interfering.
Okay, let me go to Amir and we'll continue on. Yeah.
I don't know if this is working.
I think speak louder, a little louder.
Yeah, before this interesting dialogue started, I already wanted to tell Nono that it was very heartwarming to hear that you did not think of the no-state solution, or that you don't believe in solution, you don't even believe of sovereignty within the borders of Palestine, Israel, or God forbid, going down to waters. And I do think that this is the good start. I do think that if you before jumping into binationalism, this is the direction was absolutely correct because this region was never really fragmented until Zionism appeared, and it was always functioning as culturally one organism, one way or another. Even though there was times, and here I will just refer to a phase where there was, well, we can call it a civil war, under the Ottoman Empire between a group of Druze and Christians in Lebanon, and I'm not sure if it's only one group of Christians. It happened in the 80s, 60s, and it was, in a way, wrapped up, resolved, ended by a term that transcend nationalism that we call wataniya. Actually, wataniya.
Wataniya.
And this term that was developed by Boutros al-Bustani is something that I don't really mean to offend anyone, but I mean, give Europe 1,000 years more and they will never achieve the term of wataniya, what the notion of wataniya, what it means. And it means that all these religious, cultural, traditional differences between people who are neighbors and who are sharing the one homeland, and when some farmer is sick, the other farmer is just working on his land and picking his olive trees for him, they just learn how to sustain life together. And I do think that now some upper class among Palestinians everywhere in the world, in Palestine and in the diaspora, do believe that they are a nation and that they have a Palestinian nationality. But I do agree with Lena that binationalism or even multinationalism or just the term nationalism doesn't really apply to the majority of Palestinians. If you would ask any average Palestinian, they would just, I don't know if this is what you meant by material decolonization, but if you would ask my grandmother, who is illiterate, but for me she is my greatest epistemology, if I would say. If you would ask her, who would you prefer that would govern a free Palestine in the future, she would say, I don't care, as long as they don't uproot our olive trees and just plant instead of them European pines, I'll be fine. So it's not about nationality, it's not about nationalism, it's not it's not multi, it's just how to really live together, sustain life together and with the land. And I don't think that nationality, thank you, I don't think that this nationality, a term that is very young, it's really young, much younger than this cross. I don't think maybe now it's holding, but I don't think it is sustainable. It might apply to some, but not too many. It might apply to me partially, but it doesn't really apply to me all the time, and it doesn't apply to everybody. So this is what I think that, I don't know if, I think that Boutros al-Bustani's notion of wataniya is amazing and really underexplored and should be explored in the situation of Palestine.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to respond, Lena?
I see so too many people want to say things.
Yeah.
So I can absolutely agree. I know already it's not applied to, I speak only with Palestinians and I know the problem of talking about it. I absolutely agree with the advantage you mentioned with wataniya here now, but what I think that what we have to remember in order to think is not about visions and what we really want, is that's why I try to use it as a starting point. Yes, there is something that is called Palestine, beyond the Western imagery, although Palestine indeed is also a Western concept by itself.
It exists in Arabic and pre-modern texts. It's not essentially a Western concept.
No.
The essentialism is problematic.
No. It's okay, but it's not. You're not going to jump into indigeneity. I just want to think, because there is a sovereign, how we continue thinking without jumping into visions of a future, of liberated future, which maybe we all share the idea of this liberated future, but we have no idea how to go there.
I'm going to take 3 questions, and then we'll go around. So please, yes. Sorry for pointing. Julie, FD, and Gil.
Because you talk about colonialism and say you don't know how many people in the audience here feel like this. I'm Israeli, born in Poland, in 50s, emigrated to Israel. So according to your definition, I am colonialization of the area. But the question for me is, what will be the solution? Because we hear also from the other side the point that actually the Palestinian or the Arabs are not responsible for Holocaust, and actually what the solution? The Jews which emigrated to Israel, no matter when, they should go back to those countries. So I think if the academic people will try to explain it as a logical solution, then there won't be a solution in the country. And that's I don't feel like I was colonialization, and not because the Holocaust we came to Israel, it doesn't matter. And specifically, we came because it was also a part of our tradition to think about this land. So when one here, we should uncouple it, it's very difficult and we won't reach a solution. So I prefer what the professor said, that we have to be pragmatic and not starting with defining things like if the Israelis or the people which call themselves Jews are really Jews today according to their genome or not, because we start something which will never end. So it's like the rabbis in Israel, which also maybe if they have enough power, will ask every Israeli to make a genetic test to see if they belong to Abraham or not. But I have also another remark to the...
I'm sure.
Okay, yeah.
But I have a question now to... because it's important, because it's very difficult to answer to each point of view. So I assume everything which you said is correct. So the question is that you need a partner. And the question is, what of the other side think what will be, in a present situation, a solution? Because we are saying words, 2 states, 2 nations, and so on. But a solution, really, which can hold for a longer time, is not coming. I hear all the time solutions from many scholars from Israel, but it's not, for me, it's another colonialization, because they coming with a solution I don't hear from the other side, where they say, we are for this and this solution.
Thank you for that. So Julie and Gil, and then this woman, hand your hand up over here. Daniel. Oh, Daniel. Go after.
I'm going to address my remarks to Nono. Not because I don't see the significance, of course, of Lena's argument, and there might be some details that I would quarrel with, but I actually associate myself with the general epistemological and post-colonial argument. No. You presented a kind of binary opposition between my descriptive project and yours, and I think I want to say, because I think it's crucial to get out there, that these are actually differences of shading and terminology to a great extent. Although I would not. Okay, let me just say a couple of things. You suggested that my concern is for the future of the Jewish people. It is. Yes. I think that's a larger entity than the Israeli people. And the question, the obvious question to ask of me, which I have been asked most recently a couple of days ago, is what about 7 million Israeli Jews under the no-state solution? My answer is, I don't have any objection to them staying there. I accept the fact that empirically these people are settled there. I don't have fantasies of, some eagle wings that will fly them all and deposit them in Ukraine. That's not the point at all. The point is to reimagine the structure of Jewish cultural political existence in the world, such that A, Israel, or whatever it gets called after the transformation, is decentered as being the main focus, the superior focus of Jewish existence, but part and parcel of world Jewry. Two, that, and this to me is the crucial epistemic decolonizing move, is to remove all of the symbols, all of the language, all of the imaginary of Jewish ownership of this piece of property, and certainly of Jewish superiority, which, as you yourself said, is baked into Zionism. It is baked into Zionism. So I'm not so sure how you can talk about decolonizing Zionism if it is centrally founded on both, not less so on Jewish ownership, because, as we know, it wasn't until around 1942 that the Biltmore Conference that Zionism actually adopted the idea of the state as its goal. Not that others hadn't imagined it before, but it was controversial even within the World Zionist movement. But that's not my point. But my point is that decolonization has to begin with, it has to begin with a transformation in which we stop talking about the Jewish state or a Jewish state, and in which all of the symbols and practices and language of Jewish exclusivity and Jewish ownership and Jewish superiority are systematically removed. I'm just going to say one more thing.
Okay.
I'm just going to say one more thing, which is that others before me, going back to Pinsker at least, that luminary of the imagined Zionist genealogy of Anita Shapira and ilk, always imagined spaces of Jewish autonomy, along with autonomy of other groups within Palestine. And Pinsker even wrote that the idea of it was to make a kind of model, political model, of how different groups could live together that would encourage the rest of the places where Jews were going to continue to live to treat Jews and others, and particularly Hungarians, he wrote a lot about Hungarians, as legitimate, autonomous cultural units. And I'm not going to get into a discussion now of whether nations is the useful term or not, but I will say that we must in any case clearly divide between nations, or we can call them nationalities, or national groups and nation states.
All right, thanks. So that's a good segue to Julie. So Julie, and then Gil, and then this woman here.
Okay, this is a question for Nono. I really appreciated that you started off by saying we need to talk about the state and that we need to take responsibility for the state, and that to a certain extent the political argument is precisely about what kind of state this is going to be, and that once we shift the conversation to the state, we need to start thinking politically. But I'm worried that at certain moments you're reifying Israel and reifying Zion, in the sense that at this moment, on the one hand, to my great regret, there is a very strong consensus amongst Israeli Jews about the occupation, about the war. But on the other hand, Israel is a ribbon society marked by extreme partisanship, democratic decline. Many Israeli Jews perceive that the society is on the verge of civil war. So I want to hear more from you about what it means to think politically about binationalism. Given these fissures, given these debates, do they constitute an obstacle to binational thinking? Or perhaps after October 7th, given the increasing sense of existential vulnerability and maybe changed understanding of Jewish history amongst Israeli Jews, could it be an opportunity for the kind of political thinking that you advocate?
Okay, Gil.
Thank you both. That was quite amazing. If we had time for infinite regress, I would have liked to know about the essentialist or colonial origin of the distinction between the epistemic and the material. We don't need to get into Marx, but that might be one way. I don't know whether you meant to, Lena, but the geography of what you call colonial Zionism was quite puzzling, and not only because of the French beach. And so I'm kind of wondering, and that's my question for both of you. What is the region? Because I'm totally with Nono that it is not possible to speak about, even if we speak about the river and the sea, there is a question of what's on the other side of the river. For both Ben-Gvir and for everybody who wants the river. There are many things that are happening on the other side of the river, and the region is a difficult thing. I suppose what I'm asking, it's going to sound quaint, I'm asking about global sovereignty, about the location of sovereignty in Israel, which is true to the extent that there's a nuclear option, but is also not true to the extent that the question of hegemony right now is not so very clear. And so I'm wondering for both of you, what is the region where I'm fine with calling it decolonization, if that's what it is, but where is decolonization supposed to happen? And what are the limits?
Okay, so one last question, and then we're going to have just a few minutes for each people to respond, and then we're going to have a reception downstairs, and we can continue the discussion downstairs. So this last question, and then I'll give you each 5 minutes to respond somewhat to some of what was said. Go ahead.
I have a question, then I have a general comment about the use of language. My first question, for my understanding really, is, Lena, you mentioned the false binary of statehood versus statelessness. I was wondering, perhaps it's my lack of imagination, but I don't know of a different solution to that. So what would be a third option? And the general point about the use of language that I would like to make, I think that at points it lacked certain specificity. I think if we talk about sort of Jewish supremacy being the founding principle of the State of Israel.
Superiority.
Sorry. Or sort of that being baked into the idea of Zionism. I think that is certainly true. There is that, but I think it sort of fails to mention or to think about other streams of Zionism, because one of the things that I find so frustrating in the current debate, and Zionism has essentially become a swear word, a dirty word, And yet Zionism is a lot of things. You cannot compare the Zionism of Martin Buber to that of Jabotinsky.
And we already mentioned Martin Buber.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I fully agree that these aspects exist that were mentioned in the talks, but I think they are too generalistic.
Well, thank you. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot on the table. We don't have that much time. We have about 8 minutes, 8 or 9 minutes. So if you could just offer some.
But there is someone who really was the first.
If you can do it very quickly. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, my question is first of all also to Nono, maybe more also of a response. You mentioned that Palestine is the manifestation of the exile, like the exile shows Palestine shows the exile more than ever, which to me I could be misinformed, but seems a little bit contradictory to the fact that there was already a big diaspora when the second temple was destroyed, and that, for example, the Beta Israel already were in Ethiopia before the second temple was built. And you mentioned that Palestine didn't really exist before Zionism, which I would also disagree with. Maybe not as a state, that I would agree with, because the thing of a nation state wasn't really a thing back then. It was the Ottoman Empire, but there were definitely Palestinian people, like Kurdish people. We know that Shabbatai Tzvi went to Palestine. Shakespeare wrote about Palestine, so there was definitely a thing that was called, or a land that was called Palestine, a region. And for the question of decolonization, we know that Israel claims itself the state of Jewish people, which it is not, because it has Arab citizens. I would like to make a comparison to Rhodesia, if we come to the point of decolonization and what to do with the Israeli people. They can stay there. There would be just no more Israeli state. There would just be state of Palestine, and the state of Palestine is the state of its citizens, not of Jewish citizens or Muslim or any kind of other citizen. The state is never of for a certain people. It's always of the citizens.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you for that. So again, take some do as much as you can in the few minutes that you have.
Two now.
I didn't say so. I said few. I said a few minutes.
You said few. I thought you simply stole 3 of them. And in fact, anyway, what I can do is try to prevent some misunderstandings in order to convince that, in fact, of the failures of what I say, and I'm well aware of them. Yes, I don't try to overcome them. It's part of reality. That's what is possible. First of all, don't misunderstand me. Of course, Danny, first of all, I don't think it is a dichotomy. I use it as a challenge. I'm speaking from a different perspective. I'm speaking about Israel and Israelis. I will never accept the concept of nation or nationalism as satisfactory for discussion of Jews and of Israelis. And of course, I'm talking about the state, but I will never accept Israel as a Jewish nation state. It is impossible. I mean, because it is apartheid. The problem is how to take this, but the point is to think about all these issues as a starting point. Again, if someone can tell me, I can say less than binationalism, which means that I can think politics and denying myself. So this is, in fact, the maximum I can say, and the Palestinians don't have to accept it, of course. I'm thinking about, that's why I insisted on saying it. I'm trying to think about it from this point of view. And I think that the critical process, including Lena's, is part of it. About decolonization, decolonization must be of something. I mean, yes, after all, there is a desire for a non-colonial, well, very nice. Where it comes from, we have to ask. But that's what I think. Julie, of course, you're right about the Israelis whom I'm talking. That's, in fact, when you listen to me now, you listen to attempts of the last 7 months to teach. Unfortunately, I didn't have a sabbatical this year, and I had to teach it this year. And it's not very easy, but it's something from which you learn. Because you learn from people who are dealing, of course, some of them are traumatized also. Yes, we have to remember it. But to try to find a conversation, and definitely this brought another aspect of the, I would say, the problematic presentation of myself, because I'm speaking in 2 languages, although most of the time I still spend with what else did I have to say? I still believe, yes, that the only way towards decolonization, and I really thank you, Lena, because I'm keeping thinking now about your comments. Yes, after all, or what emerged from your comments, and to think, okay, how can we take ourselves from this colonial structure? Because after all, the discussion of colonialism does not provide a non-colonial way of speaking anyway. But that, I mean, try to use the 2 minutes in order to say, I'm not sure that I will do something that I was unsuccessful to do before. And at least I just don't misunderstand me. Yes, I'm talking about starting point and not the end. And I don't think, Danny, that your thoughts are, that I'm in opposition to your thoughts, but we are not speaking about the same question. You agree with me?
Lena?
Yes, okay, so thank you. I'll start with the point that you made about the state-centric categories of statehood versus statelessness. So you see in this binary, it's about the relationship to the state, but there's another way of identifying people or thinking about identity and collectivity that has nothing to do with the state. The problem with the statehood and statelessness binary is that it is about state perspectivism, right? And so the decolonial move would be to shift that completely and to get rid of the state perspectivism. So I want to emphasize again, because I think that there was a lot of confusion about this point. Epistemic and material is not essentially Marxist or colonial, Gil. It pre-exists the modern world. But the material decolonization is clear. It's not complicated. It is a right of return for Palestinian refugees. It is return of land and compensation. It's redistribution of resources. And it is the ending of any form of Zionist hegemony. I didn't talk about material decolonization because that's not my area of specialization. I was talking about epistemic decolonization. All of the slides were about epistemic issues. So there were slides that were about secularism. And the reason why there were slides that were about secularism and in Europe was because I was trying to show you how your conscious or unconscious ways of coupling Jews and Muslims is affected by secularism, and that then that is used and instrumentalized in colonialism. So the epistemological issues are all interrelated, and there are different forms of decolonization, epistemic decolonization specifically, that need to take place in different parts of the world. These are particular, specific projects. You can't make any form of universal claim about epistemic decolonization. It's impossible. Epistemic decolonization is by definition a pluriversal process. So from my perspective, what I was trying to show is that there is an objective that needs to be foregrounded before binationalism or any other such kind of material solution, which should be a grassroots process of reconstruction and restoration. And that is about identifying and dismantling Zionist colonial notions and practices. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for coming and for staying and for asking questions. And we're going to have a reception downstairs where we can continue the discussion. Thank you all. Some